You lack the pedigree to be a real doctor, my stepdad sneered every time he caught me studying for my medical board exams. He spent his entire life making sure I felt small while pouring his fortune into his own biological son. But yesterday, the emergency room doors swung open and a paramedic wheeled in, a man suffering a catastrophic cardiac event. When he finally opened his eyes in the intensive care unit, demanding to see the chief of surgery to cover up his latest scheme, the attending physician looking down at his chart was me. I did not flinch. I just smiled, noting a fatal flaw pulsing on his electrocardiogram. Before I explain how I dismantled his empire from a hospital computer, tell me where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart a toxic family member who thought they owned you. My name is Chloe. I am 34 years old, and I serve as the chief of Cardiothoracic surgery at Boston General. The rhythmic beep of the heart monitor sliced through the quiet hum of the intensive care unit. I stood just outside the sliding glass doors of Bay 4, reviewing a digital chart. Inside lay Richard, my 62-year-old stepdad, a man who built his real estate wealth through intimidation, corner-cutting, and bullying everyone in his orbit. He had collapsed 2 hours earlier on the golf course. I watched him stir. He did not wake up with the disoriented fear typical of a heart attack survivor. He woke up annoyed. Within seconds of opening his eyes, he was already barking orders at a terrified junior nurse, demanding his phone and insisting on speaking to whoever ran the department. I pushed the glass door open and stepped into the sterile room. The crisp fabric of my white coat brushed against the edge of his bed. He stopped berating the nurse and turned his head. A flicker of shock crossed his face, quickly replaced by his trademark condescending smirk. Chloe, Richard muttered, adjusting himself against the stiff pillows. Of course they put you on my rotation. I suppose they let anyone wear a white coat these days. Tell the real doctor in charge to get in here. I have a schedule to keep. I signaled the nurse to leave us. She practically sprinted out the glass door, clicking shut behind her. I stood at the foot of his bed, my hands resting in my pockets. I am the chief of surgery, Richard, I stated, keeping my voice level. You suffered a myocardial infarction. Your arteries are clogged from decades of Scotch red meat and high blood pressure. You are staying in that bed. He rolled his eyes, unimpressed by the medical reality of his failing heart. Spare me the lecture. I am a busy man. If you actually run this place, then you can make yourself useful for once in your life. I need you to rewrite the admission notes. I tilted my head, studying him. Rewrite the notes I slipped on a defective staircase at one of my commercial construction sites yesterday. Richard lied smoothly, not breaking eye contact. The stress and the fall triggered this little chest pain. Put that in the official chart. The demand was clear. He wanted to reclassify a lifestyle-induced heart attack into a severe workplace injury. A simple keystroke on my end would activate a $500,000 disability and liability claim he had structured through his corporate insurance policy. He wanted me to commit medical fraud so he could pocket a lucrative payout. I do not forge medical records, I replied, picking up a pen to check his peripheral pulses. The blood tests and the enzyme panels already confirm the cause. You are not getting a payout for a heart attack on a golf course. Richard grabbed my wrist. His grip was weak, lacking its usual force, but the malice in his eyes remained sharp. You will write whatever I tell you to write, he hissed, the monitor speeding up as his temper flared. If you refuse, I will call my lawyers right now. I will dissolve Harper's Educational Trust Fund by noon. Your little sister can drop out of law school and flip burgers for all I care. You write the accident report or she loses her tuition today. He leaned back, satisfied, waiting for the familiar panic he had spent years instilling in me. He thought the threat of ruining Harper's future would break my professional integrity. He expected me to cave, to scramble to the computer, and forge the documents to protect my sister. I pulled my wrist free from his grasp. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue about morals or ethics. I simply looked past him, my eyes fixing on the steady rhythmic readout of his cardiac monitor. I noticed a distinct jagged spike in the waveform. It was an anomaly that had nothing to do with clogged arteries. It was a digital misfire. You should focus on breathing, Richard, I said softly, stepping back from the bed, because rewriting your chart is the least of your problems right now. I ignored his threats about ruining my sister. My eyes remained fixed on the glowing monitor mounted above his bed. The green line charting his cardiac rhythm was highly unstable. In a healthy heart, a pacemaker delivers a crisp, synchronized electrical impulse to regulate the beat. The telemetry data scrolling across the screen showed something entirely different. The electrical spikes were jagged, firing milliseconds too late, sending chaotic microcurrents directly into his fragile cardiac tissue. This was not a natural biological failure. It was a mechanical malfunction. I stepped forward, pulling a pen light from my pocket, and leaned over the bed. I checked his pupil dilation and then placed my stethoscope firmly against his chest, listening to the erratic, struggling thud of his heart. Richard tried to push my hand away, but his strength was rapidly fading. The bravado he displayed just moments ago was writing checks his failing body could no longer cash. I recognized the unique digital signature of the erratic pacing. It belonged to an Atlas 7 series module. The realization hit me like a sudden drop in temperature. The Food and Drug Administration had issued a sweeping Class 1 recall on that specific hardware over 18 months ago. The recall was triggered by catastrophic circuitry defects that caused the devices to randomly short-circuit, delivering fatal shocks to patients. It was a banned unit deemed highly dangerous and carrying severe federal penalties for any entity found distributing or implanting it within the United States. Before I could ask Richard why a multi-millionaire real estate developer had a black market federally banned piece of hardware stitched into his chest cavity, the sliding glass doors of the intensive care unit were thrust open. The quiet, sterile atmosphere of the ward shattered as 3 men strode into the room, ignoring the protests of the triage nurses stationed at the front desk. Leading the group was Chase, my 31-year-old stepbrother. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit, his hair perfectly styled, projecting the image of a flawless corporate executive. Chase was the undisputed golden child of the family. While I had spent my youth taking on crushing student loans and surviving grueling medical residencies, Chase was handed a life of unearned privilege. Richard had purchased his Ivy League degree and provided the initial seed capital to launch his lucrative medical device distribution firm. Flanking Chase were 2 men in dark suits carrying thick leather briefcases. They radiated the distinct, uncompromising aura of corporate litigation attorneys. They did not look like men arriving to comfort a sick relative. They looked like a cleanup crew arriving at a crime scene. Chase stopped at the foot of the bed, his dark eyes locking onto mine with an expression of pure, unfiltered contempt. He did not look at the monitors, and he barely glanced at his father, struggling to breathe. "Step away from the patient." Chloe Chase commanded, his voice sharp and laced with entitlement. "You are formally removed from this case. My father is being discharged immediately. We have secured a private transport team waiting in the ambulance bay." I stood my ground, slipping my stethoscope around my neck. "You do not dictate staff assignments in my department, Chase," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly level. "And your father is in critical condition. He just suffered a myocardial infarction complicated by severe arrhythmia. He is not going anywhere." One of the corporate attorneys stepped forward, pulling a folded legal document from his breast pocket. He slapped the paper onto the rolling tray table next to the bed. Dr. Sterling, the lawyer, stated, his voice a smooth, practiced baritone. "I represent Vanguard Medical Solutions. We have an emergency court order signed by a superior court judge authorizing the immediate transfer of this patient to a private specialty clinic. You are legally required to release him into our custody, or we will file an injunction against your medical license for unlawful detainment." I looked at the legal document, then back at Chase. Vanguard Medical Solutions was the very company Chase operated. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with terrifying clarity. The banned defective pacemaker currently misfiring inside Richard was not a random surgical error. Chase had supplied it. He had used his father as a convenient off-the-books client to move illegal counterfeit inventory. If Richard remained in my intensive care unit, standard protocol dictated that my surgical team would extract the failing device. We would log the serial number, photograph the hardware, and submit a mandatory adverse event report to a federal medical database. That report would instantly trigger an investigation by the Office of Inspector General, exposing Vanguard Medical Solutions as a distributor of banned lethal medical equipment. Chase was not here to save his father. He was here to extract the evidence before federal authorities caught wind of his supply chain crimes. "You want to move him to an unmonitored private clinic to cover your tracks," I said, maintaining direct eye contact with my stepbrother. "You sold him a recalled Atlas 7 unit. You used your own father to wash illegal inventory, and now the battery is failing." Chase tensed a flicker of genuine panic crossing his polished features. His jaw tightened, but he quickly recovered, leaning heavily on his attorneys for protection. "That is a baseless, defamatory accusation," Chase shot back, his voice rising in pitch. "The device is functioning within normal parameters. The hospital environment is simply causing him undue stress. Sign the release forms, Chloe. Do not make this harder than it has to be. You always were bitter that my father cut you out of the business loop. Now get out of my way." The sheer audacity of his delusion was fascinating. He genuinely believed a piece of paper signed by a judge could override the unforgiving laws of human biology. He thought his corporate wealth and legal threats held jurisdiction over a failing heart. I picked up the chart from the end of the bed, slowly clicking my pen. I did not argue about the law. I did not threaten to call hospital security. I utilized the only weapon in the room that truly mattered. "You can waive all the legal mandates you want, Chase," I said, my voice echoing coldly in the sterile room. "But let me explain the current physiological reality of the man lying in that bed. His myocardium is highly irritable. The counterfeit device you installed is currently sending unregulated microshocks directly into his ventricular tissue. It is functioning like a faulty spark plug in a flooded engine." I pointed to the monitor where the jagged green lines continued their erratic dance. Right now, the only thing keeping him from slipping into sustained ventricular tachycardia is the continuous intravenous drip of amiodarone flowing through that central line, monitored by a team of highly trained critical care nurses. Chase frowned, glancing at the monitor, his ignorance of basic medical science leaving him vulnerable. "The private transport team has paramedics," he argued, waving a dismissive hand. "They can manage an IV drip. They cannot manage a catastrophic electrical storm," I corrected smoothly. "If you unhook him from these specific telemetry monitors, transition him onto a portable gurney, and place him in the back of a moving ambulance, the physical vibration and the disruption of the medication flow will trigger an immediate lethal arrhythmia." The room grew suffocatingly quiet. The two corporate attorneys exchanged a nervous glance, suddenly realizing that their client had dragged them into a situation with severe, fatal consequences. I stepped closer to Chase, lowering my voice to a sharp clinical whisper. "If you force this transfer, the erratic shocks from that banned pacemaker will throw his heart into unrecoverable ventricular fibrillation. He will go into sudden cardiac arrest before your private transport even reaches the highway on-ramp." Chase swallowed hard, the color draining from his face. I held his gaze, delivering the final, inescapable truth. "If you sign that transfer order and pull him out of this bed, your father will be dead in exactly 10 minutes. And when the medical examiner performs the mandatory autopsy, they will extract the defective pacemaker, hand it directly to the federal authorities, and list your exact actions as the proximate cause of death. So tell me, Chase, are you prepared to upgrade your medical fraud charges to involuntary manslaughter today?" The silence that followed was profound, heavy with the realization that all his wealth and legal posturing meant nothing against the ticking clock of a failing heart. Chase stood frozen, trapped in a nightmare of his own making, while I waited for his next move. I ignored his threats about ruining my sister. My eyes remained fixed on the glowing monitor mounted above his bed. The green line charting his cardiac rhythm was highly unstable. In a healthy heart, a pacemaker delivers a crisp, synchronized electrical impulse to regulate the beat. The telemetry data scrolling across the screen showed something entirely different. The electrical spikes were jagged, firing milliseconds too late, sending chaotic microcurrents directly into his fragile cardiac tissue. This was not a natural biological failure. It was a mechanical malfunction. I stepped forward, pulling a pen light from my pocket, and leaned over the bed. I checked his pupil dilation, and then placed my stethoscope firmly against his chest, listening to the erratic, struggling thud of his heart. Richard tried to push my hand away, but his strength was rapidly fading. The bravado he displayed just moments ago was writing checks his failing body could no longer cash. I recognized the unique digital signature of the erratic pacing. It belonged to an Atlas 7 series module. The realization hit me like a sudden drop in temperature. The Food and Drug Administration had issued a sweeping Class 1 recall on that specific hardware over 18 months ago. The recall was triggered by catastrophic circuitry defects that caused the devices to randomly short-circuit, delivering fatal shocks to patients. It was a banned unit deemed highly dangerous and carrying severe federal penalties for any entity found distributing or implanting it within the United States. Before I could ask Richard why a multimillionaire real estate developer had a black market federally banned piece of hardware stitched into his chest cavity, the sliding glass doors of the intensive care unit were thrust open. The quiet, sterile atmosphere of the ward shattered as three men strode into the room, ignoring the protests of the triage nurses stationed at the front desk. Leading the group was Chase, my 31-year-old stepbrother. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit, his hair perfectly styled, projecting the image of a flawless corporate executive. Chase was the undisputed golden child of the family. While I had spent my youth taking on crushing student loans and surviving grueling medical residencies, Chase was handed a life of unearned privilege. Richard had purchased his Ivy League degree and provided the initial seed capital to launch his lucrative medical device distribution firm. Flanking Chase were two men in dark suits carrying thick leather briefcases. They radiated the distinct, uncompromising aura of corporate litigation attorneys. They did not look like men arriving to comfort a sick relative. They looked like a cleanup crew arriving at a crime scene. Chase stopped at the foot of the bed, his dark eyes locking onto mine with an expression of pure, unfiltered contempt. He did not look at the monitors, and he barely glanced at his father struggling to breathe. "Step away from the patient," Chloe Chase commanded, his voice sharp and laced with entitlement. "You are formally removed from this case. My father is being discharged immediately. We have secured a private transport team waiting in the ambulance bay." I stood my ground, slipping my stethoscope around my neck. "You do not dictate staff assignments in my department, Chase," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly level. "And your father is in critical condition. He just suffered a myocardial infarction, complicated by severe arrhythmia. He is not going anywhere." One of the corporate attorneys stepped forward, pulling a folded legal document from his breast pocket. He slapped the paper onto the rolling tray table next to the bed. Dr. Sterling, the lawyer, stated, his voice a smooth, practiced baritone. "I represent Vanguard Medical Solutions. We have an emergency court order signed by a superior court judge authorizing the immediate transfer of this patient to a private specialty clinic. You are legally required to release him into our custody, or we will file an injunction against your medical license for unlawful detainment." I looked at the legal document, then back at Chase. Vanguard Medical Solutions was the very company Chase operated. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with terrifying clarity. The banned defective pacemaker currently misfiring inside. Richard was not a random surgical error. Chase had supplied it. He had used his father as a convenient off-the-books client to move illegal counterfeit inventory. If Richard remained in my intensive care unit, standard protocol dictated that my surgical team would extract the failing device. We would log the serial number, photograph the hardware, and submit a mandatory adverse event report to a federal medical database. That report would instantly trigger an investigation by the Office of Inspector General, exposing Vanguard Medical Solutions as a distributor of banned lethal medical equipment. Chase was not here to save his father. He was here to extract the evidence before federal authorities caught wind of his supply chain crimes. "You want to move him to an unmonitored private clinic to cover your tracks," I said, maintaining direct eye contact with my stepbrother. "You sold him a recalled Atlas 7 unit. You used your own father to wash illegal inventory, and now the battery is failing." Chase tensed, a flicker of genuine panic crossing his polished features. His jaw tightened, but he quickly recovered, leaning heavily on his attorneys for protection. "That is a baseless, defamatory accusation," Chase shot back, his voice rising in pitch. "The device is functioning within normal parameters. The hospital environment is simply causing him undue stress. Sign the release forms, Chloe. Do not make this harder than it has to be. You always were bitter that my father cut you out of the business loop. Now get out of my way." The sheer audacity of his delusion was fascinating. He genuinely believed a piece of paper signed by a judge could override the unforgiving laws of human biology. He thought his corporate wealth and legal threats held jurisdiction over a failing heart. I picked up the chart from the end of the bed, slowly clicking my pen. I did not argue about the law. I did not threaten to call hospital security. I utilized the only weapon in the room that truly mattered. You can waive all the legal mandates you want, Chase, I said, my voice echoing coldly in the sterile room. But let me explain the current physiological reality of the man lying in that bed. His myocardium is highly irritable. The counterfeit device you installed is currently sending unregulated microshocks directly into his ventricular tissue. It is functioning like a faulty spark plug in a flooded engine. I pointed to the monitor where the jagged green lines continued their erratic dance. Right now, the only thing keeping him from slipping into sustained ventricular tachycardia is the continuous intravenous drip of amiodarone flowing through that central line, monitored by a team of highly trained critical care nurses. Chase frowned, glancing at the monitor, his ignorance of basic medical science leaving him vulnerable. "The private transport team has paramedics," he argued, waving a dismissive hand. "They can manage an IV drip. They cannot manage a catastrophic electrical storm," I corrected smoothly. "If you unhook him from these specific telemetry monitors, transition him onto a portable gurney, and place him in the back of a moving ambulance, the physical vibration and the disruption of the medication flow will trigger an immediate lethal arrhythmia." The room grew suffocatingly quiet. The two corporate attorneys exchanged a nervous glance, suddenly realizing that their client had dragged them into a situation with severe, fatal consequences. I stepped closer to Chase, lowering my voice to a sharp, clinical whisper. "If you force this transfer, the erratic shocks from that banned pacemaker will throw his heart into unrecoverable ventricular fibrillation. He will go into sudden cardiac arrest before your private transport even reaches the highway on-ramp." Chase swallowed hard, the color draining from his face. I held his gaze, delivering the final, inescapable truth. "If you sign that transfer order and pull him out of this bed, your father will be dead in exactly 10 minutes. And when the medical examiner performs the mandatory autopsy, they will extract the defective pacemaker, hand it directly to the federal authorities, and list your exact actions as the proximate cause of death. So tell me, Chase, are you prepared to upgrade your medical fraud charges to involuntary manslaughter today?" Chase stood frozen, the color draining from his face. The reality of a manslaughter charge hung over him, suffocating his usual corporate arrogance. His high-priced attorneys shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting toward the exit. They were paid to file injunctions, not defend a client against homicide investigations. The standoff was a delicate balance of terror and clinical authority. Then the sharp, rhythmic strike of stilettos echoed down the corridor. The sliding glass door was pushed open with desperate force. Victoria rushed into the intensive care unit, bringing a cloud of heavy floral perfume that immediately clashed with the sterile scent of the hospital. My mother was 58 years old, yet she spent a fortune on cosmetic procedures to maintain the illusion of youth. She wore a tailored beige trench coat over a designer dress, looking as though she had dressed for a society luncheon rather than a medical emergency. Victoria lived her entire life chasing status. When my biological father died, leaving us with a modest life insurance policy, she viewed it as a personal insult. Marrying Richard was her ultimate triumph. It granted her access to the country club elites and a limitless black credit card. She protected her new lavish reality with fierce, irrational loyalty, even if it meant sacrificing her own flesh and blood. She took one look at Chase, standing pale near the foot of the bed, and then turned her glaring eyes toward me. "Chloe, stop this ridiculous charade right now," Victoria demanded, her voice carrying a shrill edge of hysteria. "Chase called me from the lobby. He said you were refusing to sign the transfer papers. Do you have any idea how much stress you are causing this family?" I kept my hands resting calmly in the pockets of my white coat. "The transfer papers are a death sentence, Mother. The pacemaker Chase sold him is a banned device. It is currently short-circuiting inside his chest. If they move him, his heart stops." Victoria did not care about the medical facts. She only cared about the hierarchy she worshipped. "Do not use that condescending tone with me," she hissed, stepping closer. "You think because you wear that badge you can disrespect your stepbrother. Chase is running a multi-million-dollar company. He brought the best private transport team in the city. You will sign the release form and let them do their job." I looked at the woman who had spent my childhood telling me my ambition was a waste of time. When I studied for the medical boards, she complained that I was missing family galas. When I secured the chief of surgery position, she only asked if my new salary could contribute to the remodeling of her summer home. "I am the attending physician," I stated, my voice echoing with steady precision. I am telling you that moving him is fatal. If you want him dead just to protect Chase from a federal supply chain audit, put that in writing." The blunt translations of her motives stripped away her polished society mask. Victoria lost whatever fragile restraint she possessed. She closed the distance between us in 2 rapid strides. Her hands swung through the air, driven by decades of unchecked narcissism. Her palm struck my left cheek with a sharp, echoing crack. The sudden sound silenced the erratic beeping of the heart monitor for a fraction of a second. Chase let out a breath he had been holding, a faint smirk returning to his lips. He thought the physical correction would bring me back in line. He thought the obedient, eager-to-please daughter would resurface, cowed by maternal authority. I did not touch my face. I did not shed a single tear. The stinging sensation radiating across my skin was a minor neurological input easily discarded by a mind trained to operate under extreme trauma. I simply turned my head back to center and looked at Victoria. Her chest heaved, her eyes wide with a mixture of righteous fury and sudden creeping uncertainty. She waited for me to crumble. Instead, I stepped backward, moving smoothly toward the wall-mounted communication terminal. "You hit a medical professional performing life-saving duties inside a critical care ward," I noted, keeping my gaze locked on her trembling hands. "That is a documented assault. But more importantly, it confirms that you are actively conspiring to interfere with a critical procedure." I reached up and pressed my thumb against the biometric scanner on the terminal. I did not press the standard nurse call button. I pressed the solid red emergency override key. "Attention all staff," I spoke clearly into the microphone. "This is the Chief of Cardiothoracic Surgery. Initiate a code amber lockdown on the VIP intensive care wing. Secure all perimeter access." The hospital infrastructure responded instantly. Above our heads, the standard fluorescent lights shifted to a stark, pulsing amber hue. A low mechanical siren sounded 3 times. The heavy electronic glass doors of the intensive care unit slid shut with a forceful, definitive thud. The magnetic locks engaged simultaneously, sealing the room with tons of pressure. The 2 corporate lawyers spun around, rushing toward the exit. The lead attorney slammed his hand against the door handle, but it remained entirely unyielding. The digital keypad beside the frame glowed red, displaying a strict denial of access. "What is the meaning of this?" The lawyer demanded, his professional composure fracturing. "You cannot hold us in here. This is false imprisonment. We will have your medical license revoked by the end of the day." I turned away from the intercom panel, walking back to the center of the room. I possessed total operational control over the environment. They were no longer standing in a private hospital suite. They were standing inside a secure vault. "This is not false imprisonment," I explained, looking at the trapped men. "This is an evidence preservation protocol." Chase stepped forward, the panic returning to his features. "Evidence of what?" "You are insane, Chloe. Open the doors." 10 minutes ago, this was a simple family dispute over a medical transfer. I continued, my voice cold and surgical. "But then your mother assaulted an attending physician, and you attempted to forcibly remove a patient carrying a banned lethal device supplied by your own company. That changes the legal landscape." I pointed to the erratic lines scrolling across Richard's cardiac monitor. "That malfunctioning pacemaker is no longer just defective medical hardware. It is now the primary physical evidence in a life-threatening criminal investigation regarding the distribution of prohibited medical devices." The blood drained from Victoria's face. She looked at Chase, finally realizing that her golden child was in serious legal jeopardy. "Chloe, stop this," she pleaded, her tone shifting from aggressive to desperate. "He is your brother. We are family. We share genetics." I corrected her. "That is a biological coincidence, not a binding contract. You chose to protect a fraud over the life of the man lying in that bed." I turned my attention to the 2 lawyers who were now furiously typing on their cell phones, attempting to find a loophole in the hospital security guidelines. "Let me clarify your current standing, gentlemen," I stated, addressing the legal team. "Any attempt to transport this patient or any effort to prevent my surgical team from extracting that device will no longer be treated as a civil dispute over patient care. It will be officially logged as tampering with evidence, obstruction of a federal health and safety investigation, and reckless endangerment." The lead attorney lowered his phone. He understood the lethal severity of my words. If they touched Richard now, they would be crossing a line that ended their legal careers and landed them in a federal penitentiary. They had been hired to execute a quiet transfer, not to participate in an organized cover-up of a federal crime. Chase realized his legal shield was failing. He rushed to the foot of the bed, his breathing shallow. "You cannot do this. You cannot just cut him open and take it. It is my property. It is Vanguard inventory. It is a murder weapon," I replied smoothly, "and I am about to remove it from the crime scene." The amber lights cast long, harsh shadows across their terrified faces. The power dynamic had shifted completely. The family that had spent decades making me feel insignificant was now locked inside a glass cage entirely at my mercy. They had brought money and arrogance to a battle of science and law. They were outmatched on every conceivable level. Before Victoria could launch another desperate emotional manipulation, the intercom on the wall buzzed sharply. The triage nurse spoke through the speaker, her voice tense. "Dr. Sterling," the nurse announced. "The lockdown is secure, but there is someone at the perimeter doors demanding entry. He has federal credentials." I allowed a small, calculated smile to touch my lips. The trap was perfectly set, and the executioner had just arrived in the lobby. I authorized the security override from my wall terminal, allowing the heavy reinforced glass doors to slide apart. The pulsing amber lockdown lights cast a harsh glow across the corridor as a figure stepped into the intensive care unit. Marcus did not walk into a room. He claimed it. At 36 years old, he possessed the kind of imposing physical presence that made seasoned defense attorneys lose their train of thought. He wore a sharp midnight blue suit, his posture rigid and commanding. Marcus was an African-American man who had built an unparalleled reputation in the federal justice system. He was not here as a concerned relative. He was here as a relentless federal prosecutor for the Office of Inspector General, specializing in dismantling Medicare fraud syndicates. He was also the man who married my younger sister Harper, offering her the protection and stability our stepfather Richard had constantly threatened to revoke. Victoria let out a theatrical gasp of relief, mistakenly assuming an ally had arrived. "Marcus," she cried, stepping forward with her arms outstretched. "Thank goodness you are here. Chloe has lost her mind. She is holding us hostage and refusing to let Chase transport his father. You need to tell her she is violating the law." Marcus did not look at her. He did not offer a comforting embrace. He bypassed Victoria entirely, leaving her standing with her arms awkwardly suspended in the air. His dark, piercing gaze was locked exclusively on the 31-year-old CEO standing near the foot of the hospital bed. Chase took a hesitant step backward. The arrogant smirk he had worn since entering my ward vanished. He recognized the rectangular leather credentials folder clipped to Marcus' belt. "I am not here to mediate a family dispute," Victoria Marcus stated, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that silenced the room. "I am here in my official capacity as a representative of the United States Department of Justice." He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored jacket and produced a thick, folded document bearing a prominent judicial seal. He closed the distance between himself and Chase with predatory speed. Before my stepbrother could formulate a defense, Marcus drove the document flat against Chase's chest, forcing him to instinctively grab the paper before it fell to the floor. "You have been formally served," Marcus announced. "That is a federal subpoena for every financial ledger, internal communication log, and supply chain manifest generated by Vanguard Medical Solutions over the last 36 months." The two corporate attorneys who had accompanied Chase flinched visibly. They stared at the federal subpoena resting in their clients' hands. Their entire demeanor shifted from aggressive advocates to terrified bystanders. "What is this?" Chase stammered, his voice cracking as he looked down at the legal summons. "You cannot just walk into a hospital and serve a corporate officer. My company is operating under strict compliance protocols. We provide vital equipment to surgical centers across the eastern seaboard. You provide contraband to the highest bidder," Marcus corrected, stripping away the corporate facade with surgical precision. "My investigative team has spent the last 8 months mapping your logistics network, Chase. We tracked the serial numbers. We audited your shipping manifests. You purchased shipping containers full of recalled Atlas 7 pacemakers from a liquidated warehouse in Shenzhen. You rebranded the packaging-generated fraudulent FDA-compliant certificates and sold lethal defective hardware to private clinics operating outside standard oversight parameters." Chase opened his mouth, but his throat seemed to seize. He looked at his high-priced lawyers, silently begging them to intervene. The lead attorney simply took a slow, deliberate step away from Chase, creating a physical barrier between himself and a man facing a federal indictment. "You are tracking shadows." Marcus Chase deflected, trying to summon his executive bravado. Vanguard is a highly profitable venture. We have pristine tax returns. If you are launching a federal inquiry, you will find nothing but a successful enterprise. Marcus let out a short, humorless laugh. Vanguard is not a successful enterprise, Chase. Your company is hemorrhaging capital. You are completely insolvent. The federal government froze your primary operating accounts at 4 o'clock yesterday afternoon under suspicion of wire fraud and Medicare kickbacks. Your suppliers are demanding payment. Your creditors are preparing to file involuntary bankruptcy petitions against you. You do not have a single dollar of liquid cash to your name. The revelation struck Victoria like a physical blow. She staggered backward, gripping the edge of a rolling medical tray to keep from collapsing. She looked at her golden child, the son she had paraded around high society as a business prodigy. "Chase, what is he talking about?" Victoria demanded, her voice shrill with rising panic. "You told me the company was expanding. You told me you were preparing for an initial public offering." Chase ignored his mother. His chest heaved as he stared at the federal prosecutor, realizing the depth of the trap closing around him. The financial desperation explains the theater happening in this hospital bed. Marcus continued, turning his attention to Richard, who lay struggling for breath under the oxygen mask. I looked at Marcus, the pieces of a much darker puzzle snapping together in my mind. Richard demanding I falsify his medical records earlier this morning was not just a greedy attempt to collect a random insurance payout. I reasoned, my voice cutting through the tension. He needed that $500,000 disability claim to save Vanguard. Exactly, Marcus confirmed, meeting my gaze. Richard knew his son was facing an impending federal audit. He knew the shell companies were collapsing. They needed a massive injection of clean, untraceable cash to pay off their black market suppliers and retain criminal defense attorneys before the Justice Department filed formal charges. Richard intentionally exerted himself on the golf course, hoping to trigger a mild cardiac event to justify a fraudulent insurance claim. The sheer depravity of their scheme settled heavily over the intensive care unit. Richard had literally gambled with his own life, intentionally stressing his failing heart to generate capital for his corrupt son. But he had fundamentally miscalculated the severe defect of the counterfeit pacemaker Chase had sold him. He intended to stage a minor injury, but the black market hardware was actively executing him. "You set us up." Chase snarled, his face twisting into an ugly mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He pointed a shaking finger at Marcus. "You used Harper to spy on us. You used your own wife to dig into our family finances just to build your pathetic career. Leave my wife out of your mouth," Marcus warned, his tone dropping to a dangerous, lethal register. "Harper warned you years ago that taking shortcuts would end your career. You chose to traffic illegal medical hardware. You built a kingdom on a fault line, and I am simply the man handing you the eviction notice." The reality of his impending destruction broke Chase. The pristine corporate image shattered, leaving behind a desperate, cornered animal. He realized he was standing in a sealed room, holding a federal subpoena, with his illegal inventory ticking like a time bomb inside his father's chest. He had no money, no leverage, and no escape route. He lost all rational control. Chase let out a primal, furious scream. He dropped the federal subpoena and lunged across the short distance separating him from the prosecutor. He pulled his right fist back, aiming a reckless, violent strike directly at Marcus' face. He intended to batter his way out of the humiliation. Marcus did not flinch. He planted his feet, anticipating the attack, ready to neutralize the physical threat and add assaulting a federal officer to the growing list of charges. But the blow never landed. Before Chase could complete his swing, a sound pierced the heavy atmosphere of the room. It was a sharp, continuous, high-pitched tone, cutting through the tension like a siren. I whipped my head toward the telemetry monitor mounted above the bed. The erratic, jagged green spikes dancing across the screen had vanished. The digital display now showed a stark, flat, continuous line. The machine flashed a brilliant, blinding red. Flatline. Richard Hart had stopped. The counterfeit pacemaker had finally delivered the fatal, chaotic shock that sent his myocardium into complete electrical failure. He was in sudden cardiac arrest. The legal battle evaporated, instantly replaced by the unforgiving demands of my profession. I shoved Chase hard in the chest, using his own forward momentum to knock him off balance and send him stumbling into the glass wall. "Code Blue!" I shouted, my voice projecting through the open intercom channel on the wall terminal. "Code Blue, ICU Bay 4. Bring the crash cart now. Victoria shrieked a raw, guttural sound, covering her face with her hands as she watched her husband seize and go limp against the pillows. I vaulted over the edge of the rolling tray table, positioning myself directly over Richard's chest. I locked my hands together, interlacing my fingers, and pressed the heel of my palm hard against his sternum. I initiated chest compressions, driving my weight downward, listening to the sickening crack of cartilage as I forced his heart to manually pump blood to his brain. 1, 2, 3, 4. I counted aloud, maintaining the grueling rhythm. The heavy glass doors slid open, overriding the lockdown protocol as my trauma team flooded into the room. Nurses wheeled in the red defibrillator cart, unspooling wires and tearing open packets of emergency epinephrine. The room became a synchronized blur of clinical action. Charged to 200 joules, I commanded, maintaining my compressions. Charged, a nurse responded, holding the defibrillator paddles ready. Clear, I yelled, lifting my hands away from his chest. The nurse pressed the paddles to his skin and delivered the shock. Richard's lifeless body jerked violently against the mattress. I kept my eyes locked on the monitor, praying for a rhythm to emerge. The green line remained stubbornly flat. Resume compressions, I stated, locking my hands back over his sternum. Push 1 milligram of epinephrine. Prepare for immediate emergency transport to operating room 2. I looked up through the chaos-locking eyes with Chase, who was staring at his father in absolute horror. He had sold the device that was currently killing the man on the table. I have to crack his chest open, I told my team, my focus narrowing to the singular task ahead. The pacemaker is continually short-circuiting. Defibrillation will not hold a rhythm until that hardware is physically severed from his cardiac tissue. We move him right now. My team unlocked the wheels of the hospital bed. We pushed the heavy gurney past the terrified lawyers, past the weeping Victoria, and past a paralyzed Chase. I remained on the bed, straddling his legs, delivering relentless compressions as we rolled out into the bright, glaring lights of the surgical corridor. I was rushing the man who had despised my very existence into an operating theater. I had to slice through his sternum, extract the illegal evidence his son had implanted, and fight the Grim Reaper to keep him alive. If I failed, he died a victim of his own greed. If I succeeded, I would hand him back to a federal prosecutor waiting to send his entire legacy to a penitentiary. The surgical doors swung open, welcoming me into the sterile, cold sanctuary where I held absolute authority. The heavy steel doors of Operating Room 2 sealed shut behind my team, locking the chaos of the corridor outside. The atmosphere inside the surgical theater was an environment I commanded with absolute precision. The air smelled sharply of antiseptic and the metallic tang of sterilized instruments. The temperature was kept deliberately frigid to suppress bacterial growth, but the adrenaline flooding my system rendered me immune to the cold. I scrubbed in with practiced, rapid movements, my mind operating on dual tracks. I had to physically save the life of a man who had spent 3 decades trying to destroy my self-worth, and I had to secure the mechanical evidence that would ultimately guarantee his federal prosecution. The irony was profound, but my focus remained entirely clinical. Scalpel, I demanded, holding out my gloved hand the moment I stepped up to the operating table. My lead surgical nurse, Sarah, slapped the cold steel instrument into my palm. Sarah and I had performed hundreds of procedures together. She anticipated my needs before I voiced them, operating with a silent, fierce loyalty that transcended standard hospital protocols. We had successfully restored a fragile, temporary sinus rhythm using a massive dose of intravenous amiodarone and a synchronized cardioversion shock just prior to incision. But Richard was hanging on by a microscopic thread. The erratic electrical signals from the band pacemaker were still firing blindly, creating a hazardous environment for his damaged heart muscle. I made the initial incision straight down the midline of his chest, parting the tissue to expose the sternum. The oscillating saw whined loudly as I breached the bone, granting me direct access to the thoracic cavity, retractors. I instructed placing the heavy metal spreaders to hold the rib cage open. There it was. The heart of the man who had always told me I lacked the pedigree for medicine was beating weakly beneath my gloved hands. Just above the cardiac silhouette, nestled in the subcutaneous pocket near his collarbone, sat the source of the lethal chaos, the counterfeit Atlas 7 pacemaker. Its metallic casing gleamed under the harsh surgical lights, a silent, deadly testament to his son's unbridled greed. The device was wired directly into the right ventricle. I needed to sever those leads immediately to stop the rogue electrical impulses from triggering another fatal cardiac arrest. "Wire cutters," I said, reaching out my hand. Before Sarah could place the instrument in my grasp, a sharp, abrasive burst of static erupted from the wall-mounted intercom system. The sudden noise startled the anesthesiologist, causing him to glance nervously up at the speaker. Dr. Sterling, a voice boomed into the operating theater, carrying a tone of bureaucratic arrogance that instantly set my teeth on edge. "Halt the procedure immediately." I recognized the voice instantly. It belonged to Dr. Harrison Vance, the chief administrative officer of the hospital. Vance was a man who spent more time attending fundraising galas and playing golf with wealthy donors than he did advocating for patient care. He was a notorious social climber, a man who worshipped wealth and operated entirely on a transactional basis. I did not stop my hands. I carefully positioned the cutters around the primary lead wire. "I am in the middle of a critical extraction, Dr. Vance," I replied, my voice projecting clearly through my surgical mask toward the overhead microphone. "This patient is highly unstable. State your business or clear this channel." "I am ordering a halt based on severe procedural noncompliance," Vance declared, his voice echoing loudly, attempting to project authority over my surgical domain. "I have just been informed by the patient's family that you are operating without proper consent forms regarding the retention of medical hardware. The legal department has flagged this as a massive liability." My forensic instincts flared. The family had not contacted the legal department. Chase had contacted Vance. Chase knew that if I extracted that banned pacemaker and logged it into the hospital's adverse event database, the resulting federal audit would obliterate his supply chain company. He had likely promised Vance a lucrative donation to the hospital's private endowment fund, or perhaps a direct deposit to an offshore account in exchange for securing the physical evidence before the authorities could touch it. "You are acting on an emergency verbal proxy." Chloe Vance continued attempting to manipulate the narrative for the recording system. "Therefore, I am dispatching an administrative risk management team to your operating room right now. The moment you remove that pacemaker from the patient's chest cavity, you will place it directly into their custody. They will transfer it to risk management for secure holding, pending an internal review. Do you understand?" He was setting the stage for a classic evidentiary disappearance. If I handed that counterfeit device to his administrative team, it would be logged incorrectly, misplaced in a basement storage locker, or accidentally incinerated in the biohazard disposal unit before the sun came up. Chase would walk away clean, and the federal subpoena Marcus had served would yield nothing but dead ends. "Dr. Vance," I stated, executing a precise cut and severing the first ventricular lead. The monitor above me instantly stabilized the erratic green spikes, smoothing out into a slow, reliable sinus rhythm. The mechanical threat to the patient's heart was neutralized. "This is a Class 1 recalled device," I explained, keeping my tone perfectly professional while my hands worked to sever the remaining atrial wire. "Hospital protocol explicitly mandates that extracted defective hardware must be sealed, logged by the attending surgeon, and submitted directly to the Food and Drug Administration's adverse event reporting system. Handing it to risk management violates federal compliance. I am the chief administrative officer," Vance snapped, abandoning the polite corporate jargon. "I determine compliance protocols in this facility. You will surrender that device to my team, or I will suspend your surgical privileges the second you step out of those scrubs. That is a direct order from the hospital board." He was banking on my fear of losing the career I had sacrificed everything to build. He expected the threat of suspension to force my compliance. He vastly underestimated my preparation. I extracted the small, heavy titanium device from the subcutaneous pocket. I held the counterfeit pacemaker in my gloved hand, examining the serial number etched into the casing. It was the physical manifestation of federal wire fraud and illegal medical distribution. "Sarah," I said, turning to my trusted lead nurse, "please retrieve a Faraday isolation container from the secure supply cabinet." Sarah did not hesitate. She moved swiftly to the back of the room, pulling a specialized lead-lined metallic box, typically used to transport sensitive radioactive isotopes or protect delicate electronics from magnetic interference. She popped the lid open and held it out. I dropped the band pacemaker into the container. The heavy metal lid snapped shut with a definitive, satisfying clank, instantly blocking any wireless telemetry signals the device might still be transmitting. The evidence was secured. "Dr. Sterling, I am warning you," Vance shouted through the intercom, his frustration boiling over. "I have security personnel heading to your floor right now. Hand over that hardware." I stepped away from the operating table, leaving my surgical assistants to close the patient's chest. I walked directly over to the wall-mounted intercom panel, looking up at the small red light indicating the channel was active. "Dr. Vance, I suggest you consult with the hospital's legal counsel before you send security personnel to interfere with a federal investigation," I said, my voice dropping to a smooth, icy calm that carried across the surgical theater. I pressed a button on the adjacent digital display screen, bringing up a live feed icon that glowed bright green in the corner of the monitor. Because this procedure involved the emergency extraction of a federally banned class, one recalled device, I initiated the Project Sentinel protocol. Prior to scrubbing in, I informed him, fabricating the official-sounding title on the spot, relying on his bureaucratic ignorance to sell the bluff. "What are you talking about?" Vance demanded, his voice faltering slightly. "As the chief of cardiothoracic surgery, I am authorized to utilize the new digital compliance network we installed last quarter," I explained with flawless clinical authority. "Every monitor readout, every audio transmission, and the high-definition surgical camera mounted directly above this operating table are currently streaming live on a secure encrypted feed." The silence on the other end of the intercom was sudden and profound. "That feed is not stored on our internal hospital servers, Dr. Vance. It is transmitting directly to the data centers at the Office of Inspector General and the Federal Department of Health and Human Services for training and compliance oversight." I paused, letting the sheer weight of my statement crush his corrupt intentions. "So I invite you to continue demanding that I hand over physical evidence of a federal crime to an unauthorized administrative team. Please state your name clearly for the recording and repeat your threat to suspend my medical license for refusing to participate in the destruction of evidence. The federal prosecutors currently monitoring this feed will find your instructions fascinating." The intercom emitted a sharp, high-pitched squeal as someone on the other end fumbled frantically to mute the microphone. The transmission cut off abruptly, leaving the operating room in total silence, save for the rhythmic, steady beep of Richard's stabilizing heart monitor. Vance was trapped. He knew that if even a fraction of what I said was true, demanding the pacemaker on a recorded federal feed would result in his immediate indictment for obstruction of justice and accessory to medical fraud. The arrogant administrator had tried to flex his bureaucratic muscle, and he had sprinted headfirst into a brick wall of legal liability. He would not send security. He would not demand the device again. He was currently sitting in his plush executive office, desperately trying to figure out how to distance himself from Chase's sinking ship before the federal agents arrived to audit his own financial records. Sarah looked at me over her surgical mask, her eyes crinkling at the corners in a hidden smile. She picked up the heavy Faraday container, holding it securely against her chest. "Where to?" Dr. Sarah asked softly. "We follow the chain of custody precisely," I replied, turning back to the operating table to oversee the final suturing. "We seal it, we log the serial numbers in our secure database, and we hand it directly to the federal prosecutor waiting in the ICU. The evidence does not leave my sight until it is in government custody." My stepfather was breathing steadily, his chest rising and falling in a controlled rhythm supported by the ventilator. I had successfully repaired his heart, saving his life. Now it was time to step back out into the hallway and permanently dismantle his legacy. The heavy steel doors of the surgical corridor slid open, offering a stark transition from the sterile chill of the operating theater back into the emotionally charged atmosphere of the intensive care unit. I walked out with purposeful, measured steps, my scrubs replaced by a clean white coat. Sarah walked close behind me, her hands firmly gripping the lead-lined Faraday container, holding the counterfeit Atlas 7 pacemaker. The scene waiting for us in the ICU lobby resembled a frozen standoff. Chase was pacing furiously near the nurses' station, his phone pressed to his ear, likely screaming at his panicked legal team. Victoria sat rigidly in a vinyl waiting chair, clutching her designer handbag like a protective shield. Standing exactly where I had left him was Marcus. He had not moved an inch. Flanking him now was a stern-looking man wearing a dark windbreaker bearing the letters FBI. The federal cavalry had officially arrived to secure the perimeter. I approached Marcus, ignoring the hostile glare Victoria shot in my direction. The extraction was successful, I stated, keeping my voice loud enough for Chase to hear. The patient is stabilized but experiencing transient paralysis due to the prolonged erratic pacing. He is intubated and currently unable to communicate. He will remain in the recovery wing under strict observation. I turned to Sarah and gestured toward the federal agent. This is Special Agent Reynolds. Please execute the transfer. Sarah stepped forward and handed the heavy metallic box to the agent. Reynolds pulled a thick plastic evidence bag from his jacket, placed the container inside, and sealed it with a tamper-evident barcode strip. He handed Sarah an electronic tablet, allowing her to sign her name, officially documenting the transfer. Chain of custody is secured. Dr. Sterling Agent Reynolds confirmed, his voice flat and professional. This hardware is now under federal jurisdiction. It will be transported directly to our forensic laboratory for serial number verification. Chase ended his phone call abruptly, shoving the device into his pocket. He stared at the sealed evidence bag in the agent's hands, his face turning a sickly ashen gray. The realization that his multi-million-dollar supply chain fraud was currently sitting in an FBI evidence locker completely drained his arrogant bravado. He had lost the physical proof, and he knew a federal indictment was imminent. But while Chase was busy hyperventilating over his impending arrest, my mother was refusing to surrender control. Victoria had spent her entire life manipulating reality to fit her desires, and she was not about to let a federal investigation ruin her carefully constructed narrative. She stood up from the vinyl chair, smoothing the skirt of her designer dress, and marched directly toward me. She did not look at the FBI agent, and she completely ignored Marcus. She pulled a thick, stapled document from her handbag and thrust it aggressively into my chest. "You are finished here, Chloe," Victoria announced, her voice dripping with venomous triumph. "Your little power trip is officially over. I have taken the necessary steps to protect my husband from your blatant incompetence." I took the document from her hands, keeping my expression entirely neutral. "What is this, Mother?" "That is a durable medical power of attorney and an emergency transfer directive," she declared, looking around the lobby to ensure the triage nurses were listening. "Richard anticipated that you might try to use your position to interfere with his care. He signed this directive assigning full medical proxy to me." She pointed a manicured finger at the paperwork in my hand. "As his legal proxy, I am formally revoking your surgical privileges regarding his case. Furthermore, I am authorizing the immediate transfer of his care to Dr. Eris Thorne. He is a private concierge cardiologist retained by Chase's company. Dr. Thorne will be arriving in 30 minutes to assume total control of Richard's recovery." The strategy was desperate but incredibly cunning. If they could not steal the pacemaker out of the operating room, they would try to steal the patient out of the hospital. By bringing in a private cardiologist paid by Vanguard Medical Solutions, they could control the medical narrative. Dr. Thorne would likely attempt to falsify the post-operative reports, claiming the heart failure was natural and downplaying the role of the defective hardware to protect Chase's company from civil liability. Victoria crossed her arms, a smug, victorious smile spreading across her face. She truly believed a piece of legal paper could overwrite a federal investigation. She believed she had outmaneuvered me using the very bureaucratic system I operated within. I looked down at the document. It appeared highly official, complete with a notary stamp and Richard's distinct, sprawling signature at the bottom of the final page. I did not argue. I simply handed the document to Marcus. "Would you mind taking a look at this, counselor?" I asked, my voice dangerously soft. Marcus took the paperwork, adjusting his suit jacket. He did not read the entire document. As an expert in medical fraud, his eyes went straight to the most critical detail on any legal medical form, the execution timestamp. Marcus scanned the signature line and then looked up, a cold, predatory amusement lighting up his dark eyes. He looked at Victoria, then shifted his gaze to Chase. Mrs. Sterling Marcus began, his tone polite, but laced with razor-sharp legal implications. "This is a remarkably thorough document. However, I notice the execution timestamp recorded by your notary indicates this proxy was signed at exactly 10:15 a.m. this morning." "That is correct," Victoria snapped defensively. "Richard insisted on signing it before the surgery to ensure his wishes were respected." "Fascinating," Marcus replied, pulling a small digital tablet from his briefcase. He tapped the screen a few times, accessing the hospital's secure electronic health record system, a database he had clearance to review during active OIG investigations. Because according to the anesthesiology logs recorded in the surgical timeline, Marcus continued turning the tablet so the screen faced Victoria. Dr. Sterling's team administered a heavy induction dose of propofol and fentanyl to your husband at precisely 9:45 a.m. to prepare him for emergency cardioversion. The smug smile instantly vanished from Victoria's face. Her eyes darted to the digital timeline displayed on the tablet. At 10:15 a.m., the exact minute this document was supposedly signed, Marcus stated, his voice ringing with undeniable finality, Richard was not sitting up discussing legal proxies. He was under deep general anesthesia, intubated, and completely unresponsive on an operating table with his chest cavity open. The lobby fell into an absolute suffocating silence. The triage nurses stopped typing on their keyboards. Agent Reynolds crossed his arms, staring intently at my mother. Marcus handed the forged proxy document directly to the FBI agent. "Agent Reynolds, please add this to your evidence log." "Wait!" Victoria gasped, her hands shaking as she realized the catastrophic error she had just made. "There must be a mistake with the timestamp. The notary might have written the wrong hour. You cannot prove he didn't sign it earlier." "I do not need to prove anything regarding the notary," Marcus countered smoothly. "I just need to look at the ink." He pointed a finger at the signature. "That is not a shaky preoperative signature from a man suffering a massive heart attack. That is a smooth, practiced forgery. And since you just presented it to a hospital administrator and a federal agent in an attempt to unlawfully alter a patient's medical care and interfere with an ongoing investigation, you have escalated this situation drastically." Chase stepped forward, trying to insert himself between Marcus and his mother. "She was just confused. She is under a lot of stress. You cannot press charges over a clerical error." "It is not a clerical error," Chase Marcus corrected, his voice dropping into a lethal, uncompromising register. "It is a Class E felony. Forging a medical directive to assume control of a patient constitutes severe healthcare fraud. You and your mother just handed the federal government documented proof of a conspiracy to commit medical malpractice and obstruct justice." Victoria's legs seemed to lose their structural integrity. She stumbled backward, landing heavily in the vinyl waiting chair. She looked at the forged document securely resting in the FBI agent's hands. She had tried to use the law as a weapon to destroy my authority, and she had ended up handing the federal prosecutor the exact rope needed to hang her. The illusion of her untouchable high society status shattered completely. She was no longer a wealthy matriarch dictating orders. She was a prime suspect in a federal fraud investigation, and she had absolutely no escape route. The intensive care lobby felt like a vacuum after Marcus handed the forged medical proxy over to the federal agent. Chase stood completely paralyzed, his mind unable to process the velocity of his impending ruin. Agent Reynolds turned his attention entirely to securing the physical evidence, leaving the toxic remnants of my family exposed under the harsh fluorescent lighting. Victoria sat in the vinyl waiting chair, staring at the empty space where her fabricated power had just evaporated. But people like my mother do not surrender when their lies are exposed. They pivot. They mutate from aggressive tyrants into desperate weeping victims, utilizing emotional extortion as their final desperate weapon. She stood up abruptly, her designer heels clicking sharply against the linoleum. She did not look at Marcus or the FBI agent. She locked her frantic, tear-filled eyes directly onto me. She grabbed my forearm, her manicured nails digging painfully through the fabric of my white coat, and physically dragged me away from the nurse's station. I did not resist. I wanted to hear exactly what delusion she planned to deploy next. She pulled me into a sterile, windowless medical supply closet located just off the main corridor. The room smelled strongly of bleach and latex. She slammed the heavy wooden door shut, severing us from the chaotic aftermath in the lobby. The moment the door clicked into its frame, Victoria collapsed against a rack of sterile saline bags. She buried her face in her hands, releasing a loud theatrical sob that echoed in the small space. It was a performance I had witnessed countless times during my childhood, whenever she needed to extract money or obedience from my late father. "Chloe, please," Victoria wailed, looking up at me with mascara running down her cheeks. "You have to stop this. You have to tell your husband to call off the federal agents. Tell them the pacemaker data was corrupted. Delete the surgical logs. You are the chief of surgery. You have the administrative clearance to wipe the server." I leaned back against the cool metal shelving, observing her performance with clinical detachment. "You want me to commit federal cybercrime to hide Chase smuggling operation?" I asked, my voice flat. "He is your brother," she sobbed, stepping closer and attempting to grab my hands. I stepped back, keeping my distance. "He is a criminal who sold a lethal banned device to his own father," I corrected her. "He endangered hundreds of patients for a profit margin. I will not destroy my medical license to protect his supply chain." "You do not understand," Victoria cried, her voice cracking as genuine, unfiltered panic began to bleed through her manufactured tears. "This is not just about Chase going to prison. This is about us losing absolutely everything. If Vanguard Medical Solutions is audited and shut down, I am ruined, Chloe. I will be on the street." I frowned, analyzing the sudden shift in her narrative. "Why would Chase Company going bankrupt put you on the street? You and Richard have millions in real estate trusts. His assets are completely insulated from Vanguard corporate liabilities." Victoria swallowed hard, avoiding my gaze. Her eyes darted nervously around the supply closet, searching for an escape from the truth she was about to reveal. The silence stretched heavy and suffocating until the sheer desperation of her situation forced the confession from her lips. "Richard does not know about the loans," she whispered, her voice trembling with terror. "What loans?" I demanded, sensing a catastrophic financial anomaly. 8 months ago, Chase lost a major distribution contract." Victoria admitted, her words rushing out in a frantic defensive stream. "Vanguard was going to default on its payroll. He needed a massive injection of liquid capital to secure that new inventory from overseas to save the company. Richard refused to give him the cash. He told Chase to let the business fail. So I had to help him. I am his mother. I had to protect his future." My heart rate remained steady, but a dark suspicion began to form in my mind. "You do not have liquid capital, Mother. Your name is not on any of Richard's primary accounts. How did you secure a multi-million-dollar loan?" Victoria looked down at the linoleum floor. Her hands shook violently as she twisted her expensive wedding ring. "I used the collateral I had access to." The air in the supply closet turned to ice. My mind raced through the limited assets my mother controlled prior to her marriage to the real estate mogul. There was only one property she held the sole deed to. It was the house I grew up in, the historic Victorian home my biological father had purchased and placed in her name before he died. It was the house he had explicitly told her to keep unencumbered to ensure Harper and I always had a financial safety net. "You remortgaged the house," I stated, the realization hitting me with sickening clarity. "You took a predatory high-interest commercial loan against my father's property to fund a black market medical smuggling operation for your stepson." She looked up, tears streaming down her face, attempting to justify her monumental betrayal. "I had to, Chloe. Chase promised me he would pay it back within 6 months. He said the new pacemakers would triple his revenue. But the supply chain got delayed, and the interest rates skyrocketed. The bank is demanding the principal balance by the end of the month. If Vanguard is seized by the federal government today," she continued, her voice rising in hysteria, "Chase cannot pay the loan. The bank will foreclose on the house. Richard will find out I secretly leveraged our property to go behind his back, and he will divorce me. I will lose my country club memberships. I will lose the estate. I will have absolutely nothing left." The sheer, breathtaking selfishness of her confession was staggering. She had gambled away the only tangible legacy my father had left his daughters, not to survive a medical emergency or a natural disaster, but to bankroll an illegal enterprise for a spoiled, arrogant man who was not even her biological child. She did not care about the patients Chase endangered. She did not care about my medical ethics or Marcus' federal career. She only cared about maintaining her elite social standing and hiding her deceit from her wealthy husband. "You have to bail us out," Chloe Victoria demanded, shifting seamlessly from a weeping victim back into an entitled tyrant. "You are the highest earner in this family now. You make a fortune as the chief of surgery. You need to pay off the commercial loan before the bank forecloses, and you need to delete those surgical files so Chase can keep his company running. It is your responsibility to fix this." "My responsibility?" I asked, my voice dangerously soft. "Yes," she snapped, her desperation fueling her delusion. "You owe me. I raised you. I clothed you. I put up with your endless studying and your boring medical ambitions. You owe this family your loyalty. You have the money to make this go away quietly." I looked at the woman standing in front of me. For 34 years, I had searched for a shred of genuine maternal affection in her eyes. I had worked grueling 80-hour weeks, exhausted myself in trauma wards, and built a flawless professional reputation, hoping that one day she would look at me with the same pride she reserved for Chase. Standing in that sterile closet, watching her demand I commit a federal crime to save her country club status. The final illusion shattered. She had never viewed me as a daughter. I was simply a financial failsafe. I was a human insurance policy, a highly lucrative bank account she expected to drain whenever her poor choices caught up with her. I did not scream. I did not hurl insults or demand an apology she was incapable of giving. I simply raised my left wrist, pulling back the sleeve of my white coat. Attached to my wrist was a hospital-issued smart device synchronized directly with the secure electronic health record system. It was a tool I used daily to record patient surgical notes on the fly. The screen was currently illuminated, displaying a bright red microphone icon that was blinking steadily. Victoria stared at the device, her brow furrowing in confusion. "What is that?" "This is the hospital clinical dictation software," I explained, tapping the screen to stop the recording. It utilizes a secure encrypted cloud server to transcribe audio directly into a patient official file. I activated it the moment you dragged me away from the nurse's station. The remaining color drained completely from Victoria's face. Her jaw dropped open, a silent gasp caught in her throat. "Everything you just said," I continued, my voice cold and precise. "Your admission to securing a fraudulent commercial loan, your knowledge of Chase illegal supply chain, and your explicit demand that I destroy federal medical evidence has just been digitally transcribed, time-stamped, and permanently uploaded to the hospital's secure servers. You recorded me," she whispered, backing away, until her shoulders hit the metal shelving. "I documented a threat to patient safety and a conspiracy to commit medical fraud," I corrected her. "That audio file cannot be deleted even by an administrator. It is a permanent medical record, and I will be forwarding a copy directly to Marcus and Agent Reynolds before I leave this closet." "Chloe, you cannot do this," Victoria pleaded, her legs giving out as she slid down the shelving, collapsing onto the linoleum floor. "I am your mother. You are destroying my life." I looked down at the pathetic, weeping woman who had just tried to auction off my medical license to save her ego. "I did not destroy your life, Victoria," I stated, opening the heavy wooden door to leave. "You destroyed it the moment you decided a counterfeit pacemaker was worth more than the truth. Good luck explaining the foreclosure to Richard." I walked out of the supply closet, leaving her crying alone in the dark, and headed back into the chaotic ICU lobby, ready to deliver the audio file that would permanently bury her. But before I could reach Marcus, the elevator doors at the end of the hall slid open, unleashing a brand new, highly volatile threat into the ward. I left the supply closet and stepped back into the bright corridor of the intensive care unit. My finger rested on the digital device in my pocket, holding the audio file that would bury my mother. I intended to hand it directly to Marcus, but a sudden sharp alert from the central nursing station diverted my path. The primary triage nurse waved me over, her expression tense. "Dr. Sterling," she said, lowering her voice, "the patient in Bay 4 is conscious. He self-extubated and is demanding his personal belongings. He is highly agitated." I glanced toward the glass walls of Richard's recovery room. The heavy sedation required for emergency open-chest surgery usually keeps a patient incapacitated for hours. Richard, however, possessed a notoriously high tolerance for narcotics, a byproduct of his decades spent consuming premium scotch and unregulated pharmaceuticals. He had bypassed the recovery window and woken up in a state of venomous clarity. I walked into his room. The mechanical ventilator tube lay discarded on the sterile tray table. Richard was propped up against the pillows, his skin a sickly pale gray. A fresh, thick bandage covered the length of his sternum. He was clutching his personal cell phone in his trembling hand, his eyes burning with a feral, dangerous energy. He had felt his own chest. He knew the unauthorized pacemaker was gone. He realized his master plan to extort the insurance company and fund his son's illegal supply chain had been surgically removed and handed over to federal agents. "You stole my property." Richard rasped, his voice a harsh, grating whisper due to the raw irritation in his throat. He glared at me, gripping the cell phone like a weapon. "You brought the federal government into my hospital room. You think you can outsmart me in my own city. You are a patient in critical recovery, Richard." I replied, maintaining a safe clinical distance from the bed. You need to lower your heart rate before you trigger another ischemic event. The device was defective. Extracting it saved your life. I do not care about my life, he hissed, spitting the words with pure malice. I care about my legacy. You ruined Chase. You ruined my company. Now I am going to erase yours. He unlocked his phone, his thumb swiping aggressively across the screen. He pulled up his contacts list, bypassing his legal team and his corporate fixers. He was going straight to the top of the food chain. I initiated a call and placed the phone on speaker, resting it on his chest so he did not have to hold it to his ear. The line rang twice. A deep, polished voice answered on the other end. Winston, a man said. Winston Sterling was a name that commanded reverence within the walls of Boston General. He was a billionaire medical investor and the largest single philanthropic donor to the hospital. He funded the entire cardiovascular research wing, paying for the state-of-the-art equipment my surgical team used every single day. Winston held a seat on the executive board of directors. He possessed the unilateral power to hire fire and destroy any medical professional in the building with a single phone call. Richard and Winston shared a superficial country club acquaintance built on mutual golf tournaments and charity galas. Richard considered them peers. Winston, it is, Richard, he croaked, forcing his voice to sound weak and victimized. I am lying in the intensive care unit at Boston General. I need your immediate intervention. Richard the billionaire responded, his tone shifting to polite concern. I had no idea you were admitted. What happened? I am being held hostage by a rogue surgeon. Richard lied, his eyes locked on mine with triumphant cruelty. My stepdaughter Chloe is the attending physician. We have a bitter personal history, and she is using her medical authority to settle a family grudge. She performed an unauthorized extraction procedure on me without my consent. She is abusing me, Winston. She is refusing to release me to my private doctors. I stood near the heart monitor, listening to the staggering magnitude of his deception. He was weaving a narrative of medical malpractice and elder abuse, attempting to leverage the billionaire influence to crush my career. She has lost her mind, Richard continued, pushing a fake sob into his performance. I need you to call the hospital board right now. I need her medical license suspended before she kills me. You fund this hospital, Winston. You own these administrators. Fire her. The line was quiet for a brief moment. I am on my way, Winston stated, his voice hardening into a wall of authoritative ice. I will handle the situation personally. Do not let anyone touch you. The call disconnected. Richard let his head fall back against the pillows, a wretched, smug smile spreading across his pale face. The physical exertion of the phone call left him breathless, but he thrived on the toxic adrenaline of impending victory. Pack your locker, Chloe, he whispered, panting heavily. The board will strip your credentials by dinner time. You will be blacklisted across the entire Eastern Seaboard. You will never hold a scalpel again. You will spend the rest of your life buried in medical debt while I watch you scrub floors for a living. I did not flinch. I did not attempt to defend my actions or beg him to reconsider. I picked up his medical chart from the end of the bed, noting his stabilizing blood pressure. I logged the time of his extubation with calm, methodical strokes of my pen. Your vitals are steady, Richard. I observed, ignoring his threats entirely. Try to get some rest. You have a very long day ahead of you. I stepped out of his room, leaving him to steep in his arrogant delusions. The hospital corridor was a hive of nervous energy. Dr. Vance, the corrupt hospital administrator, had caught wind of Winston Sterling's impending arrival. Vance was currently pacing near the nurses' station, sweating profusely through his expensive suit. He knew a visit from the hospital's largest benefactor usually signaled a major administrative shakeup. 30 minutes later, the doors of the VIP elevator slid open. Winston Sterling stepped into the intensive care unit. He was a towering man in his late 60s with sharp silver hair and an impeccably tailored navy overcoat. He radiated generational wealth and institutional power. He did not walk, he marched. Behind him trailed 3 anxious hospital board members, scrambling to keep pace with his long strides. Dr. Vance practically tripped over his own feet, rushing forward to greet the billionaire. Mr. Sterling Vance stammered, extending a trembling hand. We are honored by your visit. I assure you whatever misunderstanding occurred with your associate, we are prepared to rectify it immediately. Winston ignored the outstretched hand. He bypassed the administrator, stepping directly toward Bay 4. Richard saw his wealthy savior approaching and attempted to sit up in his hospital bed, pointing a dramatic, trembling finger toward the glass doors. "There she is," Richard croaked, projecting his voice as loudly as his healing sternum would allow. "That is the doctor who assaulted me. Have them remove her, Winston. Have her escorted out by security." Dr. Vance, eager to appease the angry donor, turned toward me with a furious scowl. "Dr. Sterling, hand over your badge," Vance demanded, his voice cracking with artificial authority. "You are officially suspended pending a full disciplinary review. Step away from the patient." Winston crossed the threshold into the recovery room. He stopped near the foot of the bed, his sharp gaze scanning the medical monitors, the discarded ventilator tubing, and the heavy bandages wrapped around Richard's chest. He looked at the man trying to orchestrate a corporate execution from a hospital mattress. Then Winston turned his head and looked at me. The raw fury that had propelled him through the hospital corridors instantly vanished. The rigid posture of the ruthless billionaire dissolved. He reached up and slowly removed his bespoke reading glasses, folding them with meticulous care and slipping them into his breast pocket. He did not look at Dr. Vance. He did not acknowledge Richard's frantic barking. He walked past the bed, bridging the gap between us, until he stood mere inches away. Winston bowed his head. It was a slight, profound gesture of absolute respect that sent a shockwave through the crowded room. "Dr. Chloe," he said, his voice thick with a sudden, overwhelming reverence, "I did not realize you were the attending physician on this floor today." Richard's jaw dropped. The smug, triumphant smile was wiped from his face, replaced by a look of sheer incomprehension. He stared at the billionaire, trying to process why the most powerful man in the hospital was bowing to his despised stepdaughter. Winston turned his attention back to Richard. The warmth in his eyes was replaced by a chilling, calculating frost. 3 months ago, Winston began his tone slicing through the sterile air like a scalpel. My 12-year-old daughter was admitted to the pediatric cardiothoracic wing of this hospital. She suffered from a rapidly deteriorating aortic valve. Her condition was critical. Every senior surgeon on the eastern seaboard reviewed her charts and refused to operate. They told me the mortality risk was too high. They told me to prepare for a funeral. Winston paused, gesturing toward me with a steady hand. Dr. Chloe was the only attending physician willing to step into that operating room. She stood over my daughter for 9 agonizing hours. She executed a procedure that the medical board deemed impossible. She pulled my child back from the brink of death and handed her back to me whole and healthy. I owe her a debt that my entire financial empire could never repay. The silence in the intensive care unit was absolute. Dr. Vance took a slow, terrified step backward, realizing he had just attempted to suspend the personal savior of the hospital's largest donor. Richard's face turned a sickly, translucent white. His heart monitor spiked, alarming the triage nurses, but no one rushed into the room. He realized the monumental, catastrophic error he had just made. He had attempted to weaponize a billionaire against the very woman who held that billionaire child life in her hands. "You called me here," Winston continued, stepping closer to Richard, his voice dropping to a dangerous, unyielding whisper, to demand, "I destroy the career of the most brilliant ethical surgeon in this facility. You claimed she was abusing her authority. But knowing the character of the woman standing in this room, I can deduce with absolute certainty that whatever procedure she performed on you was entirely justified and medically necessary." Winston leaned over the bed, resting his hands on the metal safety rails. He looked down at the pale, trembling real estate developer. "If Dr. Chloe extracted a device from your chest," Richard Winston stated with lethal clarity, "it is because that device did not belong there. You tried to use my influence to execute a personal vendetta against a woman I consider family. That is a mistake you will not recover from." The power dynamic in the room shattered completely. Richard's ultimate trump card had just bent the knee to his intended victim, leaving the corrupt patriarch entirely defenseless against the incoming federal storm. The color entirely drained from Richard's face, leaving his skin resembling wet parchment. His jaw hung slack as the gravity of Winston's declaration crushed the remaining oxygen from his lungs. The billionaire investor was not just refusing to fire me, he was publicly validating my authority and exposing Richard's malicious intent in front of the hospital board. Winston straightened his posture, looking down at the real estate developer with an expression of profound, chilling disgust. "I review the portfolios of the men I do business with," Richard Winston stated, his voice ringing with a cold corporate finality. "I tolerate aggressive market tactics. I tolerate ruthless negotiation. But I draw a strict, unyielding line at medical fraud. If you are willing to traffic illegal hardware through your own son's supply chain to defraud an insurance company, you are a liability." Winston turned his head slightly toward Dr. Vance, who was currently sweating profusely and desperately trying to blend into the medical charting carts. "Contact my legal team immediately," Vance Winston ordered, not bothering to look at the terrified administrator. "Inform them that effective immediately, my firm is pulling our primary funding from all 4 of Richard's commercial development projects in the Seaport District. We are initiating the material breach clauses in his contracts due to his impending federal investigation. Liquidate our positions today." Richard let out a strangled, breathless gasp. The heart monitor above his bed flared, the rhythmic beeping accelerating into a rapid, frantic tempo. The machine blared a high-pitched warning as his systolic pressure skyrocketed. He clutched the sheets, his eyes wide with genuine, unadulterated terror. Winston's development funding was the only structural pillar holding Richard's over-leveraged real estate empire together. By pulling those investments, the billionaire had just triggered a cascading financial collapse. The commercial banks holding Richard's secondary loans would see the withdrawal panic and immediately call in his massive debts. He was bankrupt before the afternoon shift change. "No." Richard choked out his hand, flying to his bandaged chest. "Winston, you cannot pull the funding. The structural steel is already ordered. The penalty clauses will ruin me. I will lose everything. You lost everything the moment you brought a federal investigation into this hospital." Winston replied smoothly, buttoning his navy overcoat. "Consider the liquidation an early penalty for attempting to destroy the career of the woman who saved my daughter's life. Good day, Richard." Winston turned his back on the hyperventilating patriarch, offered me one final respectful nod, and strode out of the intensive care unit. The hospital board members scrambled after him like terrified ducklings, leaving Dr. Vance standing frozen, silently calculating the catastrophic damage to his own administrative career. The chaos inside Bay 4 was absolute. Nurses rushed forward to push intravenous beta blockers, frantically working to stabilize Richard's dangerously high heart rate. Victoria, who had emerged from the supply closet just in time to witness her husband's financial execution, stood paralyzed in the doorway. She stared at the medical monitors, realizing that her desperate scheme to save her country club status had just resulted in total, inescapable poverty. But while the medical staff focused entirely on keeping Richard alive, my eyes tracked a different movement in the periphery of the room. Chase was retreating. My 31-year-old stepbrother, the arrogant CEO who had stormed into my ward, waving legal mandates and demanding the counterfeit pacemaker, was slowly, silently backing away from the foot of the bed. He did not look at his father gasping for air. He did not look at his mother weeping in the doorway. His survival instinct had completely overridden any shred of familial loyalty. He knew the FBI agent had the physical evidence. He knew Winston was severing the financial lifelines. He knew an indictment for medical fraud conspiracy and distributing banned devices was only hours away. He was executing the final play of a desperate criminal flight. Chase slipped through the sliding glass doors, merging seamlessly into the chaotic flow of the hospital corridor. I watched his tailored suit disappear around the corner, heading directly toward the VIP elevator bank. He was likely planning to reach his luxury vehicle drive straight to Logan International Airport and purchase a one-way first-class ticket to a non-extradition country using whatever liquid capital remained in Vanguard Medical Solutions' corporate accounts. I did not chase him. I did not shout for security to stop him. I simply stood by the monitoring station, a cold, predatory anticipation settling in my chest. Chase thought he was outsmarting the system by running. He had no idea that the system had already built a cage around him. Down the hall, Chase mashed his finger against the elevator call button, his breath coming in short, erratic bursts. He pulled his expensive smartphone from his jacket pocket, his thumb flying across the screen. He opened his banking application, attempting to authorize a massive wire transfer from his corporate operating account directly to an offshore holding shell in the Cayman Islands. He needed to move the cash before the federal authorities officially flagged his name in the banking network. He initiated the transfer for $2.5 million. He tapped the biometric confirmation sensor, waiting for the familiar green checkmark indicating the funds were successfully routed. The screen blinked. The processing icon spun for 3 agonizing seconds. Then a harsh red banner dropped across the top of his phone screen. Transaction denied. Account restricted. Contact your financial institution. Chase stared at the glowing red text, his heart hammering against his ribs. He gritted his teeth, cursing the banking software, assuming it was a routine fraud alert triggered by the massive international transfer amount. He swiped away the banking app and immediately opened a private aviation booking portal. If he could not wire the money offshore, he would just buy the charter flight using his corporate black card and figure out the cash logistics once he was safely out of the country. He selected a direct flight to Dubai, entered his platinum card details, and hit confirm. The screen flashed red a second time. Payment declined, insufficient funds, or account frozen. Chase's hands began to shake violently. He dropped the phone, barely catching it before it hit the linoleum floor. He pulled his sleek leather wallet from his pocket, yanking out 3 different premium credit cards. He tried his personal gold card. Declined. He tried the secondary business account card. Declined. He was standing in the middle of a hospital corridor wearing a $3,000 suit, and he could not even authorize a $5 transaction. His financial oxygen supply had been completely surgically severed. Are you experiencing technical difficulties with your travel arrangements? Chase. The deep, resonant voice echoed off the polished walls of the elevator lobby. Chase spun around his back, hitting the stainless steel doors of the elevator shaft. Marcus stepped out from the shadows of the adjacent stairwell, holding a digital tablet in his right hand. The federal prosecutor moved with terrifying, unhurried grace, closing the distance between himself and the panicked executive. Agent Reynolds walked silently a few paces behind him, his hand resting casually near his duty belt. Marcus stopped a few feet away, tilting the tablet so Chase could clearly see the illuminated screen. The display showed a complex, highly detailed federal financial ledger bearing the official seal of the United States Department of the Treasury. Chase stared at the screen, his breath catching in his throat. "You seem surprised," Marcus noted, his tone dripping with clinical legal precision. "Did you honestly believe the Office of Inspector General investigates multi-million-dollar Medicare fraud rings without coordinating with the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division?" Chase swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically toward the stairwell door, calculating his physical escape route. "Do not even think about running," Agent Reynolds warned, stepping forward to block the path. As of 45 minutes ago, Marcus continued smoothly scrolling through the digital document. A federal judge signed a comprehensive asset freeze under the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. The IRS officially seized Vanguard Medical Solutions operating accounts, your offshore shell entities, and your personal domestic portfolios. Marcus tapped a specific line of text on the tablet highlighting a zero balance. They froze your corporate black cards. They locked your checking accounts. They even placed an immediate lien on that luxury penthouse you lease in the financial district. You do not have the funds to buy a cup of coffee from the cafeteria downstairs, let alone a private charter flight to the Middle East. The reality of his total financial annihilation crashed down on Chase, pulverizing the last remaining fragments of his arrogant corporate persona. The golden child who had spent his entire life insulated by his father's wealth and his own unearned privilege was suddenly entirely destitute. He was trapped in a hospital hallway with no money, no leverage, and a federal prosecutor holding the keys to his permanent destruction. "This is illegal," Chase stammered, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, desperate whine. "You cannot just take my company. You cannot freeze my personal assets without a trial. I have rights. I need to call my lawyers." Marcus chuckled, a dark, humorless sound that sent a chill down the corridor. "You can certainly call your lawyers," Chase Marcus offered, stepping aside slightly. "But I suspect they are currently busy answering questions from the FBI regarding their knowledge of your illegal supply chain. And since your accounts are frozen, I highly doubt they will continue offering you their premium billable hours on credit." Chase slumped against the elevator doors, his legs giving out completely. He slid down the cool metal, hitting the floor with a pathetic thud. He buried his face in his hands, realizing that his entire empire of lies had collapsed in the span of 30 minutes. He had tried to sacrifice his own father to protect his wealth, and he had ended up losing absolutely everything. But desperate men are remarkably dangerous when cornered. Chase lifted his head from his hands, his dark eyes locking onto the federal prosecutor. The panic in his expression mutated rapidly into a vicious, cornered rage. If he was going down, he was fully prepared to detonate a hidden bomb to take his enemies down with him. Chase pulled himself up from the linoleum floor, using the stainless steel elevator frame for support. The devastating reality of the federal asset freeze had stripped away his polished executive mask, exposing the desperate, malicious predator beneath. He realized he could not buy his way out of the indictment, and he could not physically escape the hospital. He had exactly one weapon left, and he intended to aim it directly at my career. He shoved past Agent Reynolds, ignoring the officer's warning glare, and marched aggressively back down the corridor toward the intensive care unit. He pushed through the sliding glass doors of Bay 4, just as my surgical team finished stabilizing Richard's blood pressure. The patient was safely sedated, his cardiac rhythm artificially maintained by an external pacing wire I had temporarily installed during the emergency extraction. Victoria, who had been weeping silently in the corner, immediately snapped her attention to her golden child. Chase ignored his mother. He bypassed the medical monitors and marched straight toward me, stopping inches away. His chest heaved, his eyes burning with a toxic mixture of panic and unadulterated hatred. He was not looking for a negotiation. He was launching a scorched earth campaign. "You think you won?" "Chloe Chase," hissed his voice vibrating with venomous desperation. "You think destroying my company and freezing my accounts makes you untouchable. You are just as dirty as I am, and I am going to make sure the entire medical board knows it." I maintained my clinical posture, crossing my arms defensively over my white coat. I was intimately familiar with his tactics. Whenever Chase felt cornered, he fabricated reality, weaponizing lies to destroy the credibility of anyone threatening his position. "Are you formulating a diagnosis, Chase, or are you preparing to commit slander in front of federal witnesses?" I asked, my voice carrying a terrifying, placid calm that echoed in the quiet room. "I am preparing to release the sterling file to every major news outlet in Boston," Chase declared, a dark, triumphant sneer twisting his features. The reference to the fabricated file did not surprise me. During my final year of medical residency, I had conducted a rigorous clinical trial analyzing post-operative infection rates. The data had exposed significant sterilization failures within a surgical supply chain managed by a subsidiary of Vanguard Medical Solutions. Chase, terrified of the financial liability, had attempted to bury the findings. When I refused to alter the data, he had hired a private investigator to manufacture a fraudulent dossier accusing me of manipulating the trial results to secure a permanent attending position at the hospital. The Hospital Ethics Committee had thoroughly reviewed the data, recognized his dossier as a blatant fabrication, and completely cleared my name. But the court of public opinion does not require ethical clearance. They only require a sensational headline. I have copies of the forged research logs, Chase threatened, stepping closer to emphasize his leverage. I have sworn affidavits from 2 of your former research assistants stating you bribed them to alter the control group data. They are fake, but they are incredibly convincing. If I leak that dossier to the press tonight, the media will tear your reputation to shreds. Boston General will be forced to suspend you pending a public inquiry. Your career as chief of surgery will be completely obliterated." Victoria, sensing a sudden shift in the power dynamic, immediately latched onto the extortion plot. The mother, who had spent her life enabling his destructive behavior, saw a desperate opportunity to regain control. "Listen to your brother, Chloe," Victoria demanded, her voice shrill and urgent as she stepped up beside him. "He is giving you a way out of this disaster. You call off the federal prosecutor right now. You sign a formal medical waiver stating that the pacemaker extraction was a routine procedure unrelated to product defect, and you sign a non-disclosure agreement protecting Vanguard from civil liability. Do it, or Chase will ruin everything you have worked for." They were openly attempting to blackmail a medical professional into participating in a federal cover-up. They believed the threat of a public scandal would force me to bend the knee. They assumed my fear of losing my prestigious title would override my commitment to patient safety and federal law. I looked at Victoria analyzing the absolute moral bankruptcy required for a mother to actively participate in the extortion of her own daughter. Then I shifted my gaze back to Chase. He was practically salivating, waiting for me to panic, waiting for me to beg him not to release the fabricated file. I did not beg. I simply turned away from him and walked calmly toward the primary clinical workstation situated at the nurse's desk. I sat down in the ergonomic chair and swiped my security badge across the terminal scanner. The dual monitors flared to life. I typed my administrative passcode with rapid, precise keystrokes. Chase followed me, standing directly behind my chair, his confidence momentarily faltering at my lack of emotional reaction. "What are you doing, Chloe? I am not bluffing. I will send the email to the press right now. You cannot send an email from a frozen corporate account." "Chase," I replied smoothly, accessing the hospital's central security mainframe. "And frankly, your fabricated dossier is remarkably uninteresting compared to the genuine, high-definition footage I secured from the loading dock security cameras last night." The arrogant sneer vanished entirely from Chase's face. I navigated through the security directories, pulling up a specific video file categorized under Hazardous Materials Management. I clicked the file, dragging it to the center of the large monitor, and hit play. The screen displayed the hospital's subterranean loading dock, illuminated by harsh yellow security lights. The timestamp on the video indicated the footage was captured at 2:15 a.m., just hours after Richard was initially admitted to the emergency room following his collapse on the golf course. The video showed a sleek, dark, luxury SUV pulling aggressively into the loading zone, bypassing the designated vendor parking spots. The driver's side door opened, and Chase stepped out into the rain. He was not wearing a bespoke suit. He wore a dark hoodie pulled low over his face, attempting to evade the cameras he clearly did not realize had been upgraded to high-resolution infrared the previous month. Chase watched the screen in absolute horror, his breathing becoming ragged as he stared at his own digital ghost. "You see, Chase," I explained, narrating the silent footage with cold, analytical detachment. "When Richard collapsed, you panicked. You knew I was the attending physician, and you knew I would immediately audit the surgical records to identify the make and model of his failing pacemaker. You realized that if I found the counterfeit device in his chest, I would inevitably trace the supply chain back to Vanguard's storage units located here at the hospital." On the screen, the digital version of Chase moved rapidly to the trunk of his SUV. He popped the hatch and began furiously hauling heavy, unmarked cardboard boxes onto the loading dock. "You needed to destroy the remaining inventory before federal agents could secure the warehouse," I continued, my voice echoing clearly for Marcus and the FBI agents standing in the lobby to hear. "But you could not risk transporting the counterfeit devices back to your corporate office, and you could not burn them in a commercial incinerator without triggering environmental alarms." The video showed Chase dragging the heavy boxes directly toward the hospital's massive red biomedical waste dumpsters. He violently shoved the boxes into the hazardous material containers, slamming the heavy lids shut and sprinting back to his vehicle. "You decided to hide the illegal pacemakers inside the hospital's biohazard disposal unit, hoping they would be incinerated along with standard surgical waste before morning." It was a desperate, incredibly sloppy maneuver. Chase stumbled backward, his hands trembling violently. "You hacked the security feeds. This is an illegal invasion of privacy. You cannot use that footage." "I do not hack." I corrected him, tapping the keyboard to pause the video on a clear, undeniable frame of his face, illuminated by a security light. "I am the chief of surgery. I have full administrative clearance to review facility safety protocols." When I recognized the banned Atlas 7 signature on Richard's monitor, I immediately flagged Vanguard's inventory cache for a security review. I simply pulled the footage to see who had accessed the loading dock. Victoria stared at the monitor, her hands covering her mouth. She finally comprehended the catastrophic magnitude of her son's stupidity. I stood up from the workstation, turning to face the completely defeated CEO. "Your fabricated dossier might generate a few nasty headlines, Chase." I stated, my tone merciless. "But this video guarantees a federal conviction. By intentionally dumping counterfeit battery-operated medical hardware into a biohazard incinerator processing stream, you did not just attempt to destroy evidence of Medicare fraud. You introduced highly explosive lithium components into a pressurized thermal destruction unit." Marcus stepped forward, joining me at the workstation. The federal prosecutor recognized the exact legal mechanism I had just deployed. He smiled a cold, predatory expression that confirmed Chase's absolute doom. "Dr. Sterling is entirely correct," Marcus announced, taking a step toward the terrified executive. Attempting to incinerate unauthorized lithium batteries in a medical waste facility constitutes a severe premeditated violation of the Environmental Protection Agency's hazardous disposal regulations. It is a federal environmental crime completely separate from your Medicare fraud charges. Marcus gestured toward the screen. "You did not just tamper with evidence, Chase. You actively endangered the lives of every sanitation worker operating that incinerator. The EPA does not negotiate settlement agreements for reckless endangerment. They pursue maximum mandatory minimums. You try to release a fake dossier to the press, and I guarantee the Department of Justice will add 5 counts of environmental terrorism to your indictment before lunch." The extortion attempt was pulverized into microscopic fragments. Chase had tried to hold my career hostage, completely unaware that I had already locked him inside an inescapable legal vault. He had absolutely nothing left to trade. His money was frozen, his supply chain was seized, and his physical actions were captured in high-definition video. Chase collapsed heavily into a nearby rolling office chair, burying his face in his trembling hands. The arrogant corporate titan was gone, replaced by a broken, weeping criminal who finally understood that his entire life was over. But the federal execution was not yet complete. The FBI agents were ready to finalize the arrests, but a critical piece of the conspiracy remained unaddressed. The orchestrator of the entire deadly scheme, the man lying stabilized in the hospital bed, was about to face a reckoning that would permanently sever his legacy. The destruction of Chase's extortion plot hung heavily in the air, leaving the 31-year-old CEO slumped in the rolling office chair, defeated and paralyzed by the mounting federal charges. Victoria stood frozen near the nursing station, her manicured hands covering her mouth as she stared at the high-definition security footage playing on a continuous damning loop across the monitor. The reality of their impending ruin had entirely crushed their arrogant posturing. But the federal machinery had only just engaged its primary gears. The heavy, secure glass doors at the entrance of the VIP intensive care unit slid open with a sharp, synchronized hiss. The atmosphere in the corridor immediately transformed. There was no shouting, no chaotic scrambling, and no dramatic cinematic entrances. A coordinated tactical team of 8 federal agents, wearing dark, unmarked suits and crisp windbreakers, displaying the stark yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, flooded into the ward. They moved with the chilling, lethal silence of apex predators executing a flawless, premeditated strike. They did not bark orders or draw weapons. Their absolute authority commanded instant compliance. The triage nurses stepped back from their stations, allowing the agents to secure the perimeter with practiced surgical efficiency. Agent Reynolds, who had been guarding the Faraday container holding the counterfeit pacemaker, gave a swift, confirming nod to the lead investigator, heading the tactical squad. The lead agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a slate-gray gaze, bypassed the weeping Victoria and the paralyzed Chase entirely. He marched directly toward the glass doors of Bay 4, where Richard lay immobilized, recovering from open-chest surgery. I followed closely behind Marcus as he joined the lead agent at the threshold of the recovery room. Richard's eyes darted frantically as the federal agents surrounded his bed. The smug, manipulative patriarch, who had spent decades intimidating contractors and bullying his family, was now trapped beneath the sterile hospital sheets, physically unable to flee. He watched with rising panic as one agent systematically unplugged his personal smartphone from the bedside charger and slipped it into a static, shielded evidence bag. "What is the meaning of this?" Richard rasped, his voice weak but laced with indignant fury. "You cannot confiscate my property without a warrant. I demand to speak to my legal counsel immediately." The lead agent did not flinch at the demand. He reached into his tailored jacket and produced a thick, heavily stamped judicial document. "We are executing a federal search and seizure warrant." Richard the agent stated, his voice a low, uncompromising rumble. "We have already secured the electronic servers at Vanguard Medical Solutions, and my team is currently executing a concurrent raid on your primary commercial real estate holdings." Richard's heart monitor spiked, the erratic beeping echoing sharply in the confined space. His gaze shot toward Chase, who had stumbled into the doorway of the recovery room, watching the scene unfold with wide, bloodshot eyes. Chase Richard choked out desperately, trying to reassert his dominance. "Tell your corporate lawyers to file an emergency injunction. They cannot tie my real estate firm to your medical supply company. We maintain strict corporate separation. Tell them you operate Vanguard independently." Chase opened his mouth, prepared to blindly defend the father he had idolized his entire life. He had spent years desperately seeking Richard's approval, viewing the seed capital for Vanguard as the ultimate validation of his worth. He was fully conditioned to fall on the sword to protect the family legacy. But Marcus stepped forward, intercepting the command before Chase could utter a single word of compliance. The federal prosecutor pulled a slim black leather portfolio from his briefcase and laid it flat on the rolling tray table at the foot of Richard's bed. "Corporate separation is a fascinating concept," Richard Marcus noted, his tone dripping with clinical legal mockery. "It works exceptionally well when you actually maintain separate operational logistics. But arrogant men rarely bother covering their tracks when they believe they are untouchable." Marcus opened the portfolio. He extracted a single crisp document, turning it so both Richard and Chase could clearly view the text. "This is a certified United States Customs and Border Protection import manifest," Marcus explained, pointing a steady finger at the dense rows of alphanumeric tracking codes. "It details the precise shipping container that arrived at the Port of Boston 8 months ago. The container holding 400 counterfeit federally banned Atlas 7 pacemakers originating from a liquidated warehouse in Shenzhen." Chase stared at the document, his brow furrowing in confusion. He recognized the manifest. He had personally arranged the logistics for that specific shipment, using the illicit inventory to boost his failing quarterly profit margins. "I handled that import," Chase stammered, his voice defensive. "Vanguard Medical Solutions is listed as the receiving entity. The logistics are entirely under my corporate umbrella. My father has nothing to do with that specific supply chain." Marcus slowly shook his head, a dark, predatory amusement flashing in his eyes. "You handled the logistics," Chase Marcus corrected, "but you did not possess the necessary international credit lines or the required federal import licensing to clear a shipment of that magnitude through customs. You lacked the financial collateral." Marcus tapped the bottom right corner of the document. "Look closely at the primary guarantor signature line. Look at who officially signed the customs declaration, authorizing the release of the counterfeit medical hardware onto American soil." Chase leaned forward, squinting at the bold black ink scrawled across the signature line. His breath caught in his throat. His entire body went rigidly still as his brain struggled to process the devastating reality printed on the page. The signature did not belong to Chase. The corporate entity listed as the primary guarantor was not Vanguard Medical Solutions. The signature belonged to Richard. The guarantor was Richard's primary commercial real estate holding company. "I do not understand," Chase whispered, stepping back from the tray table as if the document were radiating intense heat. "I signed the import authorizations. I filed the paperwork. You signed the internal company memos," Chase Marcus clarified, executing the psychological kill shot with ruthless precision. "But when it came time to submit the official, legally binding documentation to the federal government, your father bypassed your authority entirely. He utilized his real estate firm's pristine credit rating to clear the shipment." Marcus turned his piercing gaze toward Richard, who was currently sweating profusely, sinking deeper into the hospital pillows. "Your father did not just fund your company, Chase. He systematically structured the import logistics to ensure that if the counterfeit operation was ever flagged by federal authorities, Vanguard Medical Solutions would take the operational fall, but the actual physical importation of the illegal goods was legally tied to a subsidiary shell company he controlled." The horrifying truth settled over the intensive care unit like a suffocating blanket of heavy ash. The immaculate, powerful patriarch had not invested in his son's future. He had meticulously constructed a legal firewall using his own flesh and blood as the ultimate disposable asset. "He set you up as the fall guy," I stated, stepping forward to ensure Chase fully comprehended the magnitude of the betrayal. He knew distributing banned medical devices carried a mandatory federal prison sentence. He explicitly structured the corporate hierarchy so that if the FDA audited Vanguard, you would be indicted as the CEO executing the fraud. He intended to let you take the 20-year minimum sentence while he quietly liquidated the real estate shell company and walked away completely untouched. Chase stared at his father. The profound, unwavering admiration he had harbored for Richard fractured instantly, shattering into a million jagged, agonizing pieces. The realization that he was nothing more than a carefully engineered legal shield destroyed his entire identity. "You set me up." Chase breathed, his voice cracking with a raw, agonizing vulnerability. "I built that company for you. I took the risks to make you proud. And you signed the customs declarations in secret so I would go to prison if we got caught." Richard did not offer an apology. He did not attempt to comfort his shattered son. He reverted to the only defense mechanism he possessed: aggressive, narcissistic denial. "You were failing, Chase." Richard barked, his voice straining with furious exertion. "You were bleeding capital. I had to step in and secure the supply chain to protect my initial investment. You should be thanking me for keeping your pathetic company afloat. If you had just managed the inventory properly, the authorities would never have found out. You brought this disaster upon yourself by being incompetent." The sheer, breathtaking cruelty of his statement finalized the destruction of their toxic bond. Richard felt absolutely no remorse for actively planning to sacrifice his son to a federal prosecutor. "I was only angry that the plan had been exposed." Victoria let out a shrill, hysterical wail from the doorway, realizing her entire family was currently imploding in front of the FBI. But her cries were entirely ignored. The explosive confrontation had reached its critical mass, and the fallout was about to become violently unpredictable. The admission hung in the sterile air of the intensive care unit, a toxic confession that severed the final fragile threads of their familial bond. Richard had just explicitly confirmed that his son was nothing more than a calculated liability, a human shield constructed to absorb federal prison time, while the patriarch preserved his real estate empire. For 31 years, Chase had operated under the delusion that he was the golden heir, the undisputed favorite who possessed his father's unwavering respect. He had mocked my medical career, flaunted his unearned wealth, and ruthlessly cut corners in the corporate world, all driven by a desperate, pathetic need to mirror Richard's ruthless success. That illusion was now entirely pulverized. He saw his father not as a mentor, but as a predator who had calmly loaded a lethal weapon and handed it directly to his own son. The psychological fracture within Chase was instantaneous and absolute. The polished, arrogant CEO vanished. The veneer of Ivy League education and bespoke tailoring melted away, leaving a cornered, feral animal consumed by the agonizing realization of his own disposable nature. "You set me up." Chase repeated, his voice dropping from a panicked stammer to a low, guttural growl, his eyes fixed on the man lying in the hospital bed. "You were going to let me rot in a federal cell for 20 years so you could keep your country club memberships." He did not wait for Richard to formulate another condescending excuse. The betrayal ignited a primal, explosive rage that bypassed logic entirely. Chase lunged across the narrow space separating him from the hospital bed. He moved with a sudden, violent velocity that caught the federal agents momentarily off guard. He threw his body over the metal safety rails, his hands shooting out and clamping directly around his father's throat. "You pathetic, manipulative coward!" Chase screamed, spittle flying from his lips as he bore his weight down on the incapacitated patriarch. "I built that company for you. I took the risks for you. And you planned to throw me to the wolves." Richard's eyes bulged in genuine terror. His hands flew up weakly, clawing at his son's wrists. But the lingering effects of the anesthesia and the sheer physical trauma of the recent open-chest surgery rendered him entirely powerless. He let out a choked, gurgling sound, his face rapidly shifting from pale gray to a deep, congested purple as his airway was forcefully constricted. The intensive care unit instantly erupted into chaotic action. Victoria let out a piercing, hysterical shriek, scrambling across the linoleum floor. She threw herself at Chase's back, desperately pounding her fists against his tailored suit jacket, trying to pry him off her husband. "Chase, stop it!" she wailed, her designer handbag clattering to the floor. "You are killing him. Let him go." The FBI tactical team reacted with the swift, uncompromising force required of federal law enforcement. 2 large agents surged forward, wrapping their heavy arms around Chase's torso. They yanked him backward with a brutal, coordinated pull, ripping his hands away from Richard's throat. Chase thrashed wildly against the agents, kicking his legs and roaring obscenities as they wrestled him away from the bed. They slammed him forcefully against the adjacent glass partition, pinning his chest to the smooth surface. The sharp, unmistakable rasp of heavy steel handcuffs, ratcheting tightly around his wrists, echoed over his furious shouts. A third agent stepped directly into Victoria's path, holding up a rigid, authoritative hand. "Back away, ma'am," the agent commanded, his voice slicing through her hysterical crying. "Interfere with a federal arrest and you will be placed in restraints right next to him." Victoria collapsed into the vinyl visitor chair, pulling her knees to her chest, sobbing uncontrollably as she watched her golden child being physically subdued by the government. The pristine, untouchable dynasty she had spent decades curating had devolved into a violent, humiliating brawl in the middle of a hospital ward. On the bed, Richard gasped frantically for air, rubbing his bruised throat. The sudden assault had terrified him, but the presence of the federal agents terrified him far more. He watched Agent Reynolds secure the final pieces of evidence into a sealed plastic bag. He saw Marcus standing near the foot of the bed, his dark eyes radiating a cold, predatory satisfaction. Richard knew the handcuffs were coming for him next. The import manifests, the shell companies, the defective pacemakers, the evidence was insurmountable. He could not intimidate a federal prosecutor, and he could not bribe his way out of an intensive care unit surrounded by FBI agents. He needed an escape route. He needed to halt the interrogation, delay the formal arrest, and force the federal agents to retreat from his hospital room. And he knew the only force powerful enough to override a federal warrant in a hospital was an immediate life-threatening medical emergency. Richard initiated his final desperate performance. He suddenly clutched the center of his chest with both hands, his fingers digging deeply into the bandages covering his surgical incision. His eyes rolled back dramatically, and he let out a loud, agonizing groan that filled the chaotic room. He began to hyperventilate, taking rapid, shallow, ragged breaths, tossing his head from side to side on the pillows. "My heart." Richard gasped, his voice trembling with manufactured agony. "My chest is tearing apart. I cannot breathe. The pain. It is another attack. Call a doctor. I need help." The performance was incredibly convincing to the untrained eye. The sudden display of severe cardiac distress immediately altered the operational dynamics of the room. The FBI agents, trained to secure suspects but highly cautious regarding medical liabilities, instinctively stepped back from the bed. Agent Reynolds glanced at me, his expression tight with concern. "Dr. Sterling," he said, his hand hovering near his radio. "Does he need the crash cart? We can suspend the arrest protocol if he is experiencing a secondary infarction." Victoria, seizing the opportunity to derail the federal operation, jumped up from her chair. "He is dying," she screamed, pointing a frantic finger at Marcus. "You caused this. Your harassment triggered another heart attack. Get out of his room. Call the emergency team." Richard moaned louder, his body convulsing slightly on the mattress, continuing the charade. He firmly believed his performance would force the agents out into the hallway, granting him a precious reprieve to contact his defense attorneys and construct a viable medical defense against the impending charges. He thought he had successfully manipulated the system one last time. I did not move toward the crash cart. I did not call for the rapid response team. I remained standing perfectly still at the foot of his bed, my posture relaxed, my hands resting casually in the pockets of my white coat. I slowly turned my head and looked directly at the large telemetry monitor mounted on the wall above his head. The machine was actively tracking his cardiac rhythm, his blood pressure, and his oxygen saturation levels in real time. In a genuine myocardial infarction, the heart muscle cries out in distress, producing distinct, undeniable electrical anomalies. The electrocardiogram would show terrifying ST segment elevations, erratic ventricular tachycardias, or plunging oxygen levels as the heart failed to pump blood efficiently. The green line scrolling across Richard's monitor was an absolute picture of steady, healthy cardiovascular function. The electrical rhythm was a flawless, regular, normal sinus rhythm. His blood pressure rested at a perfect 120/80. His oxygen saturation remained securely locked at 99%. The surgical intervention had been a total success, and his heart was currently performing with the steady reliability of a well-tuned engine. I looked away from the monitor and shifted my gaze down to the man writhing theatrically on the bed. I let his performance drag on for another 10 seconds, ensuring the federal agents and Victoria watched him flail and gasp. Then I stepped forward, resting my hands lightly on the metal safety rail. "His heart rate is slightly elevated," I announced, my voice slicing through the frantic noise of the room with absolute clinical detachment. But that is a perfectly normal physiological response when a patient realizes they are about to spend the next 20 years in a federal penitentiary. Richard's groaning hitched his eyes snapping open to look at me in sheer panic. I turned my attention to Agent Reynolds and Marcus gesturing casually toward the glowing screen of the telemetry unit. "Normal sinus rhythm," I stated, translating the medical data for the federal authorities. "Blood pressure is optimal. Oxygen saturation is excellent. The patient is experiencing absolutely zero cardiac distress." I looked back at my stepfather delivering the final devastating blow to his manufactured crisis. "He is faking it," I declared, ensuring every single person in the intensive care unit heard my diagnosis. "He is staging a medical emergency in a deliberate, calculated attempt to obstruct a federal investigation and evade immediate arrest. You are fully cleared to proceed with your duties, Agent Reynolds. The patient is medically stable for transport to a secure holding facility." The profound silence that followed my diagnosis was the sound of Richard's final escape route being permanently sealed. He stopped grasping his chest. The exaggerated hyperventilation ceased instantly. He lay perfectly still on the hospital bed, his face pale and slack as he stared up at me. He finally understood that the young woman he had spent decades demeaning the stepdaughter he claimed lacked the intelligence to be a real doctor, possessed the absolute authority to systematically dismantle his entire existence. Agent Reynolds nodded grimly. He stepped up to the side of the bed, pulling a second pair of steel handcuffs from his tactical belt. He leaned over the defeated patriarch, his voice devoid of any mercy. "Richard, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit Medicare fraud, distribution of counterfeit medical devices, and obstruction of justice. You have the right to remain silent. I highly suggest you utilize it." The sharp click of the handcuffs securing his wrists echoed in the sterile room, a sound far more definitive than any cardiac alarm. But Richard's desperate gamble to weaponize his medical condition was about to trigger an entirely different, far more devastating corporate catastrophe. The sharp click of the handcuffs securing Richard to the bed rail echoed with absolute finality. He lay there, his chest rising and falling in shallow, panicked breaths, staring at the cold steel biting into his wrist. Chase, fully restrained and flanked by 2 tactical agents, was being marched out of the intensive care unit, his head bowed in total defeat. Victoria remained slumped in her vinyl chair, a broken, weeping spectator to the destruction of her empire. The federal agents had secured their targets, but the consequences of Richard's greed had not yet fully materialized. The sliding glass doors of Bay 4 pushed open once again. This time it was not law enforcement. 3 individuals entered the room dressed in immaculate conservative business attire. They moved with the synchronized predatory caution of corporate risk assessors. The lead individual, a woman with sharp features and a stern gaze, carried a sleek leather portfolio bearing the logo of Apex Mutual, one of the largest life and disability insurance conglomerates on the eastern seaboard. They were senior claims adjusters dispatched immediately after the hospital's automated billing system flagged Richard's admission for a catastrophic cardiac event. Richard carried a massive, highly customized executive disability policy with Apex Mutual. If a medical emergency rendered him incapable of running his real estate firm, the policy guaranteed a multi-million-dollar payout, effectively shielding his assets from collapse. Richard saw the insurance adjusters enter, and his desperation triggered a new, deeply cynical pivot. He realized the criminal charges for smuggling were inescapable, but he still needed capital to pay his high-priced defense attorneys and salvage his remaining shell companies. He needed a scapegoat, and he needed cash. He locked his eyes onto the lead adjuster, inhaling deeply to project the image of a severely traumatized victim. "You need to document everything happening in this room," Richard commanded, his voice a raspy, dramatic wheeze. "I am the victim of gross, negligent medical malpractice. This hospital Boston General implanted a defective counterfeit pacemaker into my chest without my knowledge or consent. He pointed a trembling finger directly at me, his face twisting into an expression of manufactured outrage. "That surgeon is attempting to cover it up." Richard continued, raising his voice to ensure the adjusters captured every word. "She extracted the device to hide the hospital's liability. I nearly died on that operating table because this facility failed to vet its supply chain. I will be filing a massive civil lawsuit against Boston General for medical negligence, and I expect Apex Mutual to process my disability claim immediately due to the permanent cardiac damage they inflicted upon me." The sheer audacity of his pivot was staggering. He was actively attempting to weaponize his own illegal, black-market hardware against the hospital that had just saved his life, intending to extort millions of dollars from his insurance provider in the process. The lead adjuster frowned, opening her leather portfolio and withdrawing a sleek digital tablet. She began typing rapidly, documenting his formal verbal complaint. Insurance companies despise paying massive claims, and the prospect of a multi-million-dollar lawsuit against a prestigious medical institution required immediate, rigorous investigation. Dr. Sterling, the adjuster, addressed me, her tone flat and interrogative. "The patient is making severe allegations regarding your facility's procurement protocols. If Boston General inadvertently utilized recalled hardware during a cardiac procedure, we will require immediate access to your surgical logs and your vendor supply manifests." I did not flinch under the scrutiny of the corporate adjusters. I did not attempt to defend the hospital's reputation with frantic denials or emotional outrage. I reached into the deep pocket of my white coat and withdrew a thick, securely bound manila folder. I had compiled this specific dossier hours ago, the moment I recognized the band Atlas 7 signature on his heart monitor. I walked over to the rolling tray table and placed the folder down with a heavy, definitive smack. "I strongly encourage you to review the supply chain manifests," I stated, meeting the adjuster's gaze with absolute unyielding calm, "because you will find that Boston General has never authorized, purchased, or inventoried a single Atlas 7 pacemaker in the history of this institution. Our procurement filters blocked that specific manufacturer 3 years ago due to preliminary safety concerns." The adjuster paused her typing, her eyes dropping to the manila folder. Richard's manufactured outrage faltered, a bead of cold sweat forming on his brow. I opened the folder, flipping past the initial surgical extraction logs to reveal a series of densely formatted financial and medical documents. I had not just audited my hospital's inventory. I had utilized the Integrated Regional Health Network database to track his entire medical history. "This is the patient's comprehensive surgical record," I explained, pointing to a highlighted section on the second page. "The defective pacemaker I extracted today was not implanted at Boston General. It was implanted exactly 14 months ago at a small private outpatient surgical clinic located in the suburbs." I turned the page, exposing the corporate ownership records for the specific clinic. "And that clinic," I continued, my voice carrying the lethal precision of a prosecutor delivering closing arguments, "is a wholly owned subsidiary of Vanguard Medical Solutions. The company operated entirely by his son Chase." The intensive care unit fell into a profound, suffocating silence. The lead adjuster leaned over the table, her eyes scanning the ownership documents and the surgical implantation logs. "Richard did not fall victim to medical malpractice," I informed the stunned insurance executives. "He willingly paid a private, unmonitored clinic to slice his chest open and install a federally banned counterfeit device into his own body. He deliberately implanted a ticking time bomb inside his myocardium. Why would a multimillionaire intentionally implant a defective device into his own heart?" The secondary adjuster asked, his voice laced with deep confusion. "It defies all logical self-preservation." I looked down at Richard, who was now staring blankly at the ceiling, his entire extortion plot evaporating into thin air. "He did it to establish a pre-existing medical condition," I clarified, unraveling the deepest layer of his financial deception. He knew his real estate empire was heavily overleveraged. He knew his son's company was facing a federal audit. He needed a guaranteed, multi-million-dollar exit strategy. By implanting a device he knew was prone to failure, he created a physical failsafe. He intentionally triggered the malfunction on the golf course today to initiate a catastrophic cardiac event, fully intending to cash out his executive disability policy to save his bankrupt businesses. The lead adjuster stopped typing. She slowly lowered her tablet, her expression shifting from cautious inquiry to absolute terrifying corporate fury. Insurance companies possess vast resources and teams of ruthless litigators dedicated to hunting down fraudsters. Richard had not just attempted to steal from them, he had insulted their intelligence. He intentionally orchestrated a cardiac event to trigger a payout, the adjuster confirmed, verifying the facts with a cold, predatory gleam in her eyes. "Yes," I replied smoothly. "And his attempt to blame Boston General for the implantation constitutes a secondary layer of documented fraud." The adjuster did not hesitate. She pulled a smartphone from her pocket and immediately dialed a direct extension. She bypassed the standard claims department and went straight to the executive legal division. "Get the litigation team on the line," the adjuster commanded the moment the call connected. Her eyes locked onto Richard. "We have a confirmed case of premeditated high-level insurance fraud. Flag the executive disability policy held by Richard Sterling for immediate cancellation. Furthermore, initiate the protocols to file a massive civil countersuit against his estate for attempted extortion and malicious deception." She ended the call, slipping the phone back into her pocket. She looked down at the handcuffed man lying in the hospital bed. "You will not receive a single cent from Apex Mutual," she informed him, her voice devoid of any sympathy. "In fact, by the time our legal department finishes dismantling your remaining assets in civil court, you will owe us millions in punitive damages. Have your defense attorney contact our office." The insurance executives turned in unison, marching out of the intensive care unit with the ruthless efficiency of a corporate hit squad. Richard was utterly destroyed. He was handcuffed to a bed, facing decades in federal prison for smuggling and Medicare fraud. Winston had severed his commercial funding, triggering the collapse of his real estate empire. Now the insurance conglomerate was preparing to obliterate whatever microscopic fractions of wealth remained. He had no money, no leverage, and no allies left. The powerful patriarch was reduced to a destitute, terrified prisoner trapped in a failing body. But desperate men, entirely stripped of their power, will always attempt one final pathetic maneuver to save themselves, and Richard was preparing to beg for the one thing: he had never given me mercy. The departure of the insurance adjusters sucked the remaining oxygen from the room. The sterile white walls of the intensive care unit seemed to close in around Richard, pressing the terrifying reality of his situation directly into his lungs. The federal agents stood impassively at the door, silent sentinels guarding his inevitable journey to a penitentiary. Richard was cornered. His real estate empire was collapsing, his insurance payout was revoked, and his golden child was currently sitting in a holding cell facing environmental terrorism charges. The arrogance that had fueled his entire existence evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, trembling core of pure desperation. He looked at me. The condescending sneer he had worn since my childhood was entirely gone. His eyes, usually cold and calculating, were now wide and rimmed with red. He attempted to pull himself upward against the hospital pillows, his handcuffed wrist clanking harshly against the metal safety rail. The movement sent a jolt of pain through his healing sternum, forcing a pathetic, ragged groan from his lips. "Chloe," Richard whispered, his voice cracking, shedding every ounce of his former patriarchal authority. "Chloe, please," he was begging. The man who had mocked my medical ambitions, who had threatened to ruin my sister's future just hours ago, was now literally pleading for his life. I stepped closer to the bed, looking down at him. I did not cross my arms. I maintained a relaxed clinical posture, observing his breakdown with the detached interest of a scientist studying a dying organism. "I know I have been hard on you," Richard stammered, tears pooling in the corners of his eyes and tracking through the deep wrinkles on his cheeks. "I know I was demanding. But I pushed you because I knew you were brilliant. I knew you had the strength to survive this brutal world." I was attempting to rewrite history, trying to frame decades of emotional abuse and financial manipulation as a twisted form of tough love. He genuinely believed he could gaslight me one final time to secure his salvation. "I am an old man, Chloe," he sobbed, his chest heaving. "My heart is failing. If they send me to a federal facility, I will die in a concrete cell. I will not survive the trial. You have to help me." "Help you?" I asked softly, letting the silence amplify his panic. "You are the chief of surgery." Richard pleaded, his gaze darting toward the federal agents by the door before returning to me. "You hold absolute medical authority over my chart. You can issue a formal medical exemption. You can testify that the trauma from the defective pacemaker caused permanent, irreversible cardiac damage. If you certify that I am medically unfit to stand trial, the prosecutors will have to drop the immediate charges. They will place me on compassionate medical monitoring instead of throwing me in a maximum security prison. I was asking me to perjure myself, to leverage my hard-earned medical license, to shield a criminal from federal justice. I expected me to sacrifice my integrity to save the man who had actively conspired to ruin my family. I will give you everything, Richard blurted out frantically, raising the stakes when I did not immediately respond. The primary estate, the Victorian house your father bought. I know Victoria leveraged it, but I still hold the master deed. I will sign the entire property over to you right now. It is worth millions. You and Harper will never have to worry about money again. Just sign the exemption, Chloe, please. He was attempting to buy his freedom with a house he had stolen from my mother, a property currently bleeding value due to his own illicit commercial loans. I reached into the deep pocket of my white coat. I did not retrieve my prescription pad. I did not pull out a blank medical exemption form. I pulled out a thick, legal-sized document bound by a heavy blue clip. I placed it squarely on his rolling tray table, smoothing the cover page flat. I do have a document for you to sign, Richard, I stated, my voice echoing with a cold, terrifying finality. Richard's face lit up with a sudden, desperate surge of hope. He thought he had successfully negotiated his survival. He reached out with his free, uncuffed hand, grabbing the document and pulling it toward his face, eager to see his salvation printed in black and white. But as his eyes scanned the bold, capitalized text at the top of the first page, the hope died, instantly replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated horror. "This is not a medical exemption," Richard gasped, his hand shaking so violently the paper rattled. "No," I agreed smoothly. "It is a sworn affidavit of confession." I leaned forward, resting my hands on the tray table, forcing him to look directly into my eyes. "Marcus drafted it while you were busy trying to extort the insurance adjusters," I explained. "It explicitly details your entire operational history. It outlines the Medicare fraud, the distribution of banned medical devices, the offshore money laundering, and your conspiracy to commit insurance fraud. It also includes a formal admission that you intentionally utilized Chase as a legal shield, fully intending to let your son take the fall for your federal crimes." Richard dropped the document as if it were coated in acid. He shrank back into his pillows, his breath catching in his throat. "I will not sign that," he hissed, a flicker of his old venomous defiance surfacing. "It is a death sentence. If I sign a full confession, the judge will hand me the maximum penalty. I will lose every single asset I possess. You are going to lose every asset you possess, regardless," I corrected him, maintaining my clinical detachment. "The federal government is already seizing your accounts. The bank is foreclosing on the estate. Your wealth is an illusion, Richard. You have nothing left to protect except the length of your prison sentence." I pointed to the document resting on his table. "If you sign that affidavit and fully cooperate with the federal investigators regarding your offshore shell companies, Marcus might consider recommending a standard medium security facility," I stated. I paused, letting the alternative scenario materialize in his mind. "But if you refuse to sign it, I will personally submit a certified sworn medical evaluation to the federal prosecutor." I warned, my voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "I will submit the telemetry logs, the surgical extraction reports, and my expert medical opinion confirming that your cardiovascular system is in pristine, robust condition. I will guarantee the judge that you are perfectly healthy, exceptionally lucid, and physically capable of serving out a 30-year sentence in a maximum security penitentiary." Richard stared at me, his mouth opening and closing silently. He was completely trapped. He could not fake a medical emergency because I controlled the data, and he could not bribe his way out because his accounts were frozen. I had stripped away his final defense mechanism, leaving him entirely exposed to the brutal reality of his actions. "You are a monster." Richard choked out his eyes, filling with tears of profound defeat. "I am a surgeon," I replied, turning my back on his hospital bed. "And I just finished removing a malignancy." I gave a sharp nod to Agent Reynolds. The federal officer stepped forward, pulling a heavy steel pen from his vest. He uncapped the pen and placed it firmly on top of the affidavit of confession. "Sign it," Richard Agent Reynolds commanded, his tone leaving absolutely zero room for negotiation. "Or we proceed with the maximum indictment." Richard looked at the pen, then at the federal agents surrounding him, and finally at the open doorway where his future ended. His hands trembled violently as he picked up the pen. With a ragged, defeated sob, he pressed the ink to the paper, signing his name across the bottom of the confession, sealing his own permanent destruction. But the execution was not over. The orchestrator of the fraud had fallen, but the enabler who had facilitated his reign of terror had yet to face her ultimate consequence. Victoria was standing just outside the glass doors, watching her husband sign his life away, completely unaware that the federal scythe was swinging directly toward her neck. Richard stared at the heavy steel pen resting on top of the affidavit of confession. The ink seemed to mock him. He had spent his entire career manipulating contracts, forcing vulnerable contractors and desperate tenants to sign away their leverage. Now the federal government was demanding he sign away his own life. The trembling in his hand intensified. He dropped the pen, the metal clattering loudly against the rolling tray table. He slumped back against the hospital pillows, crossing his arms in a final pathetic display of defiance. "I am invoking my Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination," Richard declared, his voice cracking, projecting a hollow bravado. "I refuse to sign anything without my personal defense attorney present. You cannot force a confession from a man recovering from major surgery. I will fight this indictment in court, and I will win." Agent Reynolds did not flinch. He simply reached out and picked up the pen, preparing to bag the unsigned document as evidence of noncompliance. Marcus, however, stepped forward. The federal prosecutor moved with the slow, deliberate grace of an apex predator circling a wounded animal. He did not look angry. He looked profoundly satisfied. "Invoking your right to remain silent is a standard tactical maneuver," Richard Marcus noted, his deep baritone filling the intensive care unit. "And if this were a simple case of isolated wire fraud, your high-priced attorneys might manage to tie the litigation up in appellate courts for years." Marcus rested his hands on the foot of the bed, leaning in close. "But this is not an isolated incident," Marcus continued, his voice dropping into a lethal, uncompromising register. "By conspiring with your son to distribute banned medical devices across state lines, and by utilizing your wife to fraudulently leverage residential property to fund an illegal supply chain, you have elevated this investigation from standard corporate embezzlement to a coordinated multi-state criminal enterprise." Richard's bravado faltered. His eyes darted nervously toward Victoria, who was standing just outside the glass doors, her face pressed against the pane, watching the interrogation with rising terror. As of this morning, Marcus announced delivering the ultimate legal execution. The Department of Justice has officially authorized the application of the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act to this specific case. We are filing RICO charges against your entire family. The acronym hung in the sterile air like a guillotine blade. Even a layman understood the devastating total annihilation associated with a RICO indictment. It was the federal statute originally designed to dismantle the mafia. It did not just target individuals, it eradicated organizations, punishing anyone remotely connected to the flow of illicit capital. Under RICO statutes, Marcus explained with clinical precision, the federal government does not need to wait for a criminal conviction to seize your assets. We have the unilateral authority to initiate immediate pre-trial civil forfeiture. That means every single dollar, every piece of real estate, and every luxury asset connected to this conspiracy is now officially property of the United States government. Marcus turned his head slowly, looking directly at Victoria through the glass partition. That includes your wife's personal offshore banking accounts, Marcus stated clearly, ensuring Victoria could hear the destruction of her precious lifestyle through the open doorway. It includes her collection of imported designer jewelry. It includes her custom vehicles and her country club equity. Everything she possesses was purchased or maintained using funds generated by your illegal medical smuggling ring. The federal agents are currently boxing up her wardrobe. She is entirely destitute. The impact of the RICO declaration hit Victoria with the force of a physical explosion. The wealthy matriarch who had spent decades curating an image of untouchable aristocratic elegance completely lost her mind. The realization that her diamond necklaces, her exclusive social standing, and her hidden safety nets were currently being bagged and tagged by the FBI shattered her fabricated reality. Victoria shoved past the tactical agents guarding the entrance, bursting into Bay 4 like a feral animal. Her designer dress was wrinkled, her perfect hair disheveled, and her face contorted into an ugly, desperate mask of pure panic. She did not rush to comfort her husband. She rushed to the tray table, grabbed the heavy steel pen Agent Reynolds had set down, and practically shoved it into Richard's cuffed hand. "Sign the paper, Richard!" Victoria screamed, her voice a shrill, hysterical shriek that echoed off the medical monitors. "Sign the confession right now!" Richard stared at his wife, utterly bewildered by her sudden, violent betrayal. "Victoria, what are you doing? I have to fight this. If I sign this, I go to prison. I do not care about your prison sentence." Victoria roared, her manicured hands gripping his hospital gown, shaking him violently against the mattress. "They are taking my money. They are taking my jewelry and my accounts. You dragged me into your pathetic, incompetent fraud, and now I am losing everything. Sign the affidavit. Take the blame. Tell them I had nothing to do with the supply chain." She turned her frantic, tear-streaked face toward Marcus, attempting to negotiate a desperate plea deal right over her husband's immobilized body. "If he signs it, if he takes full responsibility as the mastermind of the operation, will you drop the RICO charges against me?" Victoria begged, her voice cracking with pathetic desperation. "Will you let me keep my personal accounts? I was just his wife. I didn't know the pacemakers were defective. I just signed the loan papers he told me to sign. Please, Marcus. I am your mother-in-law." The sheer, breathtaking cowardice of her plea was staggering. She was actively trying to sell her husband to a federal prosecutor to save her diamond collection. She was willing to watch the man she married rot in a maximum security penitentiary if it meant she could retain a fraction of her unearned wealth. Marcus looked down at the weeping, hysterical woman, his expression devoid of any familial warmth. "The federal government does not negotiate with co-conspirators," Victoria Marcus replied coldly. "And your signature on that fraudulent commercial loan application makes you an active participant in money laundering. You are going to lose everything, regardless of what he signs." Victoria let out a guttural wail, collapsing to her knees beside the hospital bed. She buried her face in the sterile blankets, sobbing uncontrollably as her entire universe burned to ash. Richard watched his wife weeping on the floor. He looked at his son Chase, who was currently restrained by federal agents in the hallway, staring back at him with a gaze full of unadulterated hatred. He had spent his entire life manipulating and exploiting his family to build an empire of fear and control. Now, in his darkest hour, surrounded by federal agents and facing decades behind bars, that family was actively tearing him apart. His wife was trying to trade his freedom for her jewelry. His son had literally attempted to strangle him. He was completely, utterly alone, trapped in a prison of his own making long before he ever reached a jail cell. The patriarchal illusion was completely pulverized. Richard's chest heaved. The fight drained entirely from his eyes, leaving behind a hollow, terrified shell. He picked up the heavy steel pen with a trembling, defeated hand. He did not look at me. He did not look at Marcus or Victoria. He stared blankly at the medical chart resting on the table. With a ragged, breathless sigh, Richard pressed the pen to the paper. His hand shook violently, but he managed to scrawl his signature across the bottom line of the affidavit of confession, formally admitting to every single federal crime, every fraudulent wire transfer, and the conspiracy that nearly cost a man his life. Agent Reynolds stepped forward immediately, pulling the signed document away and sliding it securely into a plastic evidence bag. The execution was official. The trap was sealed. Richard dropped his head back against the pillows, closing his eyes. "I gave you everything you wanted." Richard rasped, his voice barely a whisper, addressing me for the final time. "I signed the confession. I surrendered. Now, keep your end of the bargain. Tell the prosecutor to recommend a minimum security facility, and take the deed to the Victorian estate. You and Harper take the house. Just let me serve my time quietly." I stood at the foot of his bed, watching the broken, pathetic man attempt to salvage a microscopic shred of dignity from the wreckage. He still believed he was negotiating. He still thought he possessed a final, valuable chip to trade for my mercy. I reached into the pocket of my white coat and pulled out a single folded sheet of paper. I walked around the tray table and placed it gently onto his chest, right over his healing surgical incision. "I do not want your house, Richard," I stated, my voice smooth and perfectly calm. Richard opened his eyes, frowning in confusion, as he looked down at the document resting on his hospital gown. "What is this?" "That is a formal notice of foreclosure," I explained, delivering the final devastating reality check. "I pulled it from the county clerk's public registry 3 hours ago." Richard's eyes darted across the bold black text on the page. His breathing hitched as he processed the legal jargon. "When Victoria secretly remortgaged that property to fund Chase's illegal supply chain, she took out a predatory high-interest commercial loan. I continued ensuring Victoria, still weeping on the floor, heard every single word. Because Vanguard Medical Solutions failed to make the exorbitant monthly payments, the bank initiated an accelerated default protocol." I paused, letting the silence stretch out, forcing him to absorb the absolute finality of his ruin. "The bank officially seized the property at 9 o'clock this morning," I informed him. "The house does not belong to you, Richard. It does not belong to Victoria. You tried to buy your freedom using an asset that was already repossessed by your own creditors. You sold your soul to the federal government for a promise that was completely worthless." Richard stared at the foreclosure notice. His jaw trembled, and a single tear escaped his eye, tracing a slow path down his pale cheek. The mastermind real estate mogul had been outplayed, outmaneuvered, and utterly bankrupted by the very stepdaughter he had claimed would never succeed. He was not just going to prison. He was going to prison as a destitute, humiliated failure, stripped of his wealth, his family, and his legacy. The execution was absolute. But the aftermath of their destruction would require a systematic cleansing of the hospital ward, ensuring no trace of their toxic influence remained. The harsh fluorescent lights of the intensive care unit glared down on the shattered remnants of my stepfather's empire. The foreclosure notice rested on his chest, a stark white emblem of his total financial and personal annihilation. Richard did not speak another word. He simply stared blankly at the ceiling, his spirit entirely broken. Agent Reynolds stepped forward, giving a sharp nod to his tactical team. The time for negotiations, legal maneuvers, and desperate pleas had officially expired. "We are moving the primary suspect to the secure medical wing at the federal holding facility," Reynolds announced, his voice carrying the uncompromising authority of the United States government. "Initiate transport protocol." 2 heavily armed agents disconnected Richard's secondary monitoring cables, leaving only the essential portable telemetry pack attached to his chest. They did not handle him with the deference usually afforded to a wealthy hospital donor. They treated him like exactly what he was, a federal inmate in transit. They unlocked the wheels of his hospital bed and began pushing the heavy gurney toward the sliding glass doors of Bay 4. At the same moment, the agents holding Chase in the corridor hauled him forward. The arrogant 31-year-old CEO who had stormed into my ward demanding my resignation was now shuffling awkwardly, his hands secured tightly behind his back. The bespoke tailoring of his charcoal suit bunched around the steel handcuffs, emphasizing the pathetic reality of his situation. The procession moved slowly out of the intensive care unit and into the main surgical corridor. It was a highly orchestrated, incredibly public walk of shame. News of the federal raid and the involvement of Winston Sterling had spread through Boston General like wildfire. The corridor was lined with attending physicians, surgical residents, and senior hospital administrators. They stood silently watching the spectacle unfold. Dr. Vance, the corrupt administrator who had tried to threaten my medical license to protect Chase's illegal supply chain, watched from a safe distance, his face pale and sweating. He knew his own internal audit was looming. He avoided my gaze entirely, shrinking back into the crowd of medical professionals. Chase kept his head bowed, his face burning with profound humiliation, as he was paraded past the very doctors he had intended to defraud. He could feel their disgusted stares. He knew his reputation within the medical community was permanently eradicated. He was no longer a visionary entrepreneur. He was a convicted smuggler. Richard, lying flat on the transport gurney, was forced to endure the absolute destruction of his high society facade. He passed colleagues he had previously intimidated, and hospital board members he had routinely patronized. They did not offer sympathy. They looked at him with the cold, clinical detachment reserved for a toxic liability. Victoria trailed behind the federal procession, a weeping, disheveled ghost of her former self. The agents had allowed her to leave the intensive care unit, but her freedom was a terrifying illusion. Before she reached the elevator bank, Marcus stepped smoothly into her path. "Mrs. Sterling," Marcus said, holding out a clear plastic evidence bag. As part of the active RICO asset seizure, I require you to surrender the keys to the Mercedes currently parked in the VIP garage, as well as any corporate credit cards in your possession." Victoria stared at the plastic bag, her hands shaking violently. She looked at her son being marched into an elevator by armed guards, then back to the federal prosecutor. She had absolutely no leverage left. With a ragged, defeated sob, she reached into her designer handbag. She pulled out her heavy keyring and a stack of platinum cards, dropping them into the evidence bag. The transaction stripped away the last remaining barrier between her and total destitution. "You are free to go," Marcus stated, sealing the bag. "I suggest you contact a public defender." Victoria turned and walked slowly toward the main hospital exit. She did not have a luxury vehicle waiting for her. She did not have a sprawling estate to return to. She walked out through the revolving glass doors and stepped onto the cold, rain-slicked pavement of the Boston streets. I watched her figure shrink in the distance from the lobby window, a woman waiting alone at a public bus stop, clutching a designer handbag that she could no longer afford to fill. The toxic tumor that had infected my life for 3 decades had finally been surgically excised. 6 hours later, the chaos of the federal raid had entirely dissipated, replaced by the quiet, orderly rhythm of the hospital's executive wing. I stood in my private corner office, the chief of cardiothoracic surgery. The room was bathed in the warm golden light of the late afternoon sun, streaming through the expansive floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Boston skyline. The frantic beeping of cardiac monitors and the harsh shouts of federal agents were replaced by a deep, resonant silence. The heavy mahogany door clicked open. Harper walked in wearing a sharp, tailored blazer, carrying 3 steaming cups of black coffee in a cardboard carrier. Marcus followed close behind her, having successfully finalized the booking procedures for Richard and Chase at the federal courthouse. Harper handed me a coffee, her eyes shining with a fierce, protective pride. My younger sister had spent years trapped under the oppressive weight of Richard's financial threats, terrified that her law school tuition would be revoked if she did not comply with his narcissistic demands. Today, she stood tall, completely liberated from his control. "The preliminary hearings are scheduled for Tuesday," Marcus announced, taking a sip of his coffee and leaning comfortably against the edge of my mahogany desk. Given the mountain of evidence, the forged documents, and the environmental terrorism charges added for the incinerator stunt, the federal judge denied bail for both of them. They are currently processing into the maximum security holding wing. "They thought they were untouchable," Harper said, a quiet satisfaction in her voice. "They really believed their money made them invisible." I turned back to the expansive window looking out over the city. The glass reflected my image, the crisp white coat, the embroidered title, and the calm, steady posture of a woman who had fought a grueling war and emerged completely victorious. "They relied on fear." I replied, my voice steady and resonant in the quiet office. Richard built his entire life around the assumption that if he screamed loud enough and threatened hard enough, everyone would eventually surrender. He thought he could manipulate a hospital the same way he manipulated his family. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee, savoring the bitter, grounding taste. He told me I lacked the pedigree to be a real doctor. I continued the memory of his lifelong insults fading into insignificance. He said I did not have the strength to survive in his world. I looked at Marcus, the brilliant federal prosecutor who had dismantled their financial empire, and then at Harper, the resilient sister who had refused to let their toxicity break her spirit. We were the chosen family, an impenetrable alliance forged in the fires of their abuse. He was right about one thing, I concluded, a cold, triumphant smile touching my lips. I do not belong in his world. I belong here. And from this office, I just signed his prescription for a 20-year sentence. We raised our coffee cups in a silent, unified toast. There were no tears, no lingering regrets, and absolutely no hollow apologies. The past was permanently sealed in a federal evidence locker, and the future was entirely ours to command. The surgery was a complete success, and the patient was finally wonderfully dead to me. The sun dipped below the Boston skyline, casting long, sharp shadows across my office floor. For the first time in 34 years, the pervasive, suffocating weight of my family's expectations was gone. There were no more financial threats hanging over my sister's education. There were no more manipulative phone calls demanding blind compliance. Richard and Chase were currently trading their bespoke Italian tailoring for federal-issue uniforms, and Victoria was learning the harsh mathematics of survival without a stolen credit card. I stood in the quiet sanctuary of my surgical wing, observing the city I now commanded entirely on my own terms. Surviving a dynasty built on deceit requires more than just endurance. It requires a fundamental rewiring of how you perceive loyalty and power. Looking back at the wreckage they brought upon themselves, the blueprint for dismantling toxic abusers becomes glaringly clear. First, biology is a genetic coincidence, not a binding contract. Society constantly conditions us to absorb abuse under the hollow guise of familial duty. We are told to forgive the unforgivable simply because we share a last name. But loyalty is a currency that must be earned, not extorted. When the people meant to protect you weaponize your ambitions and treat you as a disposable asset, walking away is not a betrayal. It is a necessary life-saving surgical extraction. You cannot heal a wound while stubbornly clinging to the blade that cut you. Second, never interrupt an arrogant predator when they are actively digging their own grave. The most lethal response to narcissistic manipulation is not a screaming match. It is disciplined, terrifying silence paired with immaculate preparation. While they exhaust themselves projecting false authority and spinning elaborate lies, you secure the data. You audit the medical logs. You gather the undeniable evidence. You do not fight them in the murky waters of emotional gaslighting. You drag them into the sterile, unforgiving light of factual reality and federal law, letting their own hubris serve as their executioner. Finally, construct a fortress they cannot finance. Richard maintained his tyrannical grip over his household because he controlled the capital. The moment you forge your own distinct independence, whether it is earning a medical license, building a career, or simply maintaining a bank account, they cannot access you, strip them of their primary ammunition. True, unshakable power is walking into a hostile room, knowing that your success was forged by your own hands, existing entirely out of their reach. If you have ever had to sever ties with toxic relatives to protect your peace and build your own empire, drop your story in the comments below. We read every single one. Hit that like button, subscribe to Rabbit Revenge, and remember, the ultimate response to those who claim you lack what it takes is to become the exact authority that finalizes their downfall. Stay sharp and never let anyone else hold the pen